Everyone, welcome to session 4 of the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey for the Canadian Great Lakes webinar series. This webinar series is hosted by Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. My name is Sharon Lam, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's webinar. I'm a research scientist with the Ecosystem and Climate Science team at Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, and I'm joined by an amazing group of colleagues, some of whom you'll meet over the course of this webinar. Let me begin by taking a moment to respectfully acknowledge that all of us at this virtual meeting, no matter where we are located on land that has been home to Indigenous nations since time immemorial. We respectfully acknowledge that the lands we are situated on are traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We appreciate and respect the history and diversity of land and are grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory. And we are honored to be joined by representatives of Indigenous organizations at today's webinar. Let's now go over some quick housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and slides will be shared with all of you in a couple of weeks following the completion of the webinar series. All participants are muted and video disabled to minimize disruption and save bandwidth and emissions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom control panel to post questions throughout today's session. It's really helpful for us to receive your questions in the Q&A so that we can better keep track of your questions. You can also upvote others' questions in the Q&A. To share comments, please use the chat, and thank you to all of you for sharing with us in the chat your name and where you're calling from today. Closed captioning is available in English, and you can enable or disable this by selecting the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. If you encounter any technical issues with Zoom, please message Larissa for support. And with that, let's take a look now at what we have covered so far in this 4-part webinar series before we dive into our final session today. Over the past 3 webinars, we learned about the novel Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey that covers over 1 million hectares of coastal habitat and over 8,700 kilometers of shoreline along the Canadian Great Lakes. We also learned about how to access the geospatial open data and results, which is available through the Government of Canada's Open Data Catalog for each of the Canadian Great Lakes. Data for Lake Superior has just been finalized and will be made available later this year. We journeyed along the 2-kilometer coastal margin with Environment and Climate Change Canada staff and Fisheries and Oceans Canada staff and explored the survey results for shorelines and uplands, inland and coastal wetlands, and select tributaries, which provide essential habitats for a wide range of species. This slide is just showing some of the results that we saw from the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey. We also explored some questions that can be answered with this data, such as the extent of different coastal habitats and their biodiversity, where invasive Phragmites are present, which parts of the shoreline have been hardened, where tributary impedances exist, and what habitats are currently protected. For more information or to request a walkthrough of the survey, please contact Anders Holder in Environment and Climate Change Canada. We also heard from 17 guest speakers and panelists over the 3 webinars who shared their exciting work with us from both sides of the Great Lakes, from research and monitoring to planning and implementation. We also heard about the many potential uses of the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey and the potential opportunities to collaborate. For example, Sonia from Fisheries and Oceans Canada noted yesterday that the survey results are already being used in State of Fish and Fish Habitat reports. The Integrated Planning Unit with Fisheries and Oceans Canada is also applying this data to support the development of a conservation, protection, and restoration planning framework, which we'll hear Neil speak more about today. We also heard about potential opportunities to use this data to support habitat connectivity research, the identification of aquatic barriers, and the identification of priorities, which is the focus of today's session. Through interactive polls, we also received some great feedback from the audience about key data and knowledge gaps, how participants plan to use the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey geospatial open data, and how we can help increase uptake of the results, which we will continue to explore today and through future work. With that, let's take a closer look now at what we have in store for you today. First, we'll hear from Richard Kavanagh, who will share how the identification of important habitats for conservation in the Great Lakes has evolved over time. Next, we'll hear from Neil Fisher about fish and fish habitat conservation, protection, and restoration planning. We will then switch over to a series of guest presentations to hear about the work that is being undertaken to identify priority habitats, as well as initiatives to protect and restore coastal habitats across the Great Lakes. For our 6 guest presentations, we'll be doing something different today. Instead of taking a few questions after each presentation, we'll have a quick discussion with each group of speakers after they've presented. This will also replace our panel discussion at the end. So please input your questions in the Q&A throughout the presentations, and where possible, please direct your questions to specific speakers. As you can see, we have another jam-packed session today. So instead of planned breaks, we encourage you to take a stretch from time to time over the course of the webinar. Lastly, before we dive into our presentations, we would like to bring your attention to our user questionnaire for the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey. A link to this questionnaire will be shared in the chat, and we invite you to complete this questionnaire to help Environment and Climate Change Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada understand how the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey will be helpful to you, identify local priorities for future conservation, protection, and restoration efforts, and improve future iterations of reporting and associated open data. The questionnaire includes map-based questions where you can draw on a map for your area of interest to help us better understand locally specific place-based priorities. This questionnaire will be kept open for the next month, and we look forward to your input and feedback. I will now invite Rick to share his screen while I provide a brief introduction. Dr. Richard Kavanagh is a Great Lakes Program Officer with the Great Lakes Ecosystem Management Section in Environment and Climate Change Canada. Prior to joining ECCC, Rick worked as a biologist in the Fish Habitat Protection Program in Fisheries and Oceans Canada.
Hello, everyone. An incredible amount of work has been and continues to be undertaken to identify important habitat in the Great Lakes for the purpose of conservation, protection, and restoration. Today, I'll be providing a very brief introduction to some of these initiatives. As you've already heard, in addition to nutrients and contaminants, the Great Lakes face a number of other threats. These threats to species and habitats resulted in changes to the original Canada-Ontario Agreement. In 1994 and in subsequent agreements, Canada and Ontario committed to implementing actions to not only prevent and control pollution, but to conserve species, populations, and the habitats, and protect and restore the Great Lakes ecosystem. This led to the identification of important areas of biodiversity and to the development of biodiversity conservation strategies in Ontario. And for the first time, the Habitat and Species Annex was added to the Canada-US Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 2012. So in addition to addressing water quality, commitments were made by both countries to conserve, protect, maintain, restore, and enhance the resilience of native species and their habitat, as well as support essential ecosystem services. Working with federal, provincial, and state governments, the public and other NGOs, the Nature Conservancy and Nature Conservancy of Canada developed biodiversity strategies for all the Great Lakes. Some of the key strategies include reducing the inputs of contaminants and nutrients from urban and agricultural runoff. So this is applicable to Lake Erie, Huron, and Ontario. Preventing, detecting, and reducing impacts from invasive species. Reducing the negative impacts of dams and barriers by increasing connectivity, and identifying, protecting, and restoring habitat. These strategies have indicators and criteria to identify areas of ecological significance and priority areas of conservation. They are just some of the many initiatives that have been undertaken recently to identify priority habitats through the Great Lakes. DFO, for example, has mapped the presence of aquatic species at risk and their associated habitat across Canada. This map shows the critical habitat that threatened and endangered species require for their survival and recovery. Recovery strategies and action plans have been created for these species. As you heard yesterday from Sean Staton, there has been a shift from the traditional species approach to conservation to one that focuses on multiple species and ecosystems. Using the pan-Canadian approach to transforming species at risk conservation in Canada, for example, 11 priority places have been selected because they have significant biodiversity, high concentrations of species at risk, and there are opportunities to advance conservation efforts. Additional priority places have been nominated by communities, and Heather Braun will be speaking to this initiative in greater detail today. Operating under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan to conserve and restore high priority wetland and associated upland habitat for birds in Canada, the Eastern Habitat Joint Venture has identified priority areas for waterfowl across Canada, including the Great Lakes. An extensive landscape assessment involving species at risk, migratory birds, and habitat has also been conducted by the Canadian Wildlife Service to identify local high-value biodiversity areas. Some initiatives have taken a broad approach, incorporating multiple disciplines and perspectives to assess biophysical attributes in particular locations. One example is the identification and mapping of areas of high ecological value and the nearshore waters of the Great Lakes. Jocelyn Sherwood will be providing a presentation on this initiative today. The identification of key biodiversity areas is another example of a broad approach. Over the last few years, the Key Biodiversity Areas Canada team has been working to identify key biodiversity areas for all taxonomic groups and ecosystems across Canada. These are areas that are important to sustaining wildlife and biodiversity, and were identified using criteria from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Key biodiversity areas will also be discussed today. Many initiatives share common criteria for identifying priority areas for conservation and protection. For example, an understanding of the threats to habitat and associated species is required. Some areas will be selected because they're experiencing threats, while others may be chosen because those threats are not present at that particular location, and thus they have intact and well-functioning ecosystems. Priority areas usually have or are capable of supporting large numbers of species or species at risk, and can include a diverse range of ecosystems. They often provide important breeding and nursery habitat. They may be selected because they are resilient to change, or the opposite, they are vulnerable to it. And finally, they may be considered because they are valuable for economical, social, or spiritual reasons. After reviewing all these initiatives, it would be fair to ask, well, why does this work continue? Well, the technology and means to classify wetlands and other habitat has significantly improved over time. For example, we have moved from classifying wetlands strictly by their hydrogeomorphic class to this coarse provincial wetland classification level of bogs, fens, marshes, and swamps, to refined landscape coverage using ecological land classifications from broad community classes to the ecosite level, which increases the resolution and number of classes we can interpret and map. This has been especially important for the Great Lakes coastal margin, as the GLSE inventory further splits ecosites into their fundamental drivers to resolve the finer scale details of significant ecosystems, such as the Great Lakes coastal meadow marshes. Another reason this work continues is that habitats and species within the Great Lakes remain under threat. There are over 180 aquatic invasive species known to be present in the Great Lakes. A total of 603 impedances to fish movement have been identified across the Canadian Great Lakes coastal margin. And almost 40% of the Lake Erie and Lake Ontario shorelines have been hardened. There are also emerging threats like climate change. For those who attended session 2, you will recall Hillman Marsh, the breach of its beach barrier and the impacts it's had on the marsh ecosystem. Events such as this one can be expected to occur more frequently in the future as climate models show warmer and wetter future conditions across the Great Lakes. Without action, coastal wetlands will likely be severely impacted or even lost. Fortunately, efforts are being made to protect and restore the Great Lakes ecosystem. This map shows the federal, provincial, and conservation protected areas, as well as NGO land trust fee protected property sites. The province of Ontario has created the Great Lakes Local Action Fund to support projects that protect and restore coastal, shoreline, and nearshore areas of the Great Lakes and its connecting rivers and streams. The Government of Canada has been providing funding to protect and recover species at risk and to create protected areas on private, provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous lands. And just recently, the Government of Canada announced it will be spending $420 million to clean up and restore the Great Lakes over the next decade. Please watch for future announcements from Environment Canada on this new initiative. I'm hopeful that if we use the information gathered in the baseline habitat survey and other complementary data effectively, positive outcomes could include effective use of funds by implementing targeted restoration and protection actions, and by developing new targeted funding programs, effective direction of scientific studies and monitoring efforts, improved decision-making and management, improved engagement and awareness efforts through maps, reports, and fact sheets, and ultimately, the achievement of net habitat gain. Identifying conservation, protection, and restoration priorities is truly a shared responsibility that should involve federal agencies, provincial and municipal agencies, Indigenous communities, community stewardship groups, non-government organizations, and stakeholders. We should all look for opportunities to coordinate our efforts wherever possible. Only by working together can we solve the significant challenges the Great Lakes are facing. I hope you will enjoy hearing more about these and other initiatives that advance our mutual goal of conserving, protecting, and restoring Great Lakes habitat and species in today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the great presentation, Rick, and for setting the stage so nicely. We'll now invite Neil to join us. Neil, please go ahead and share your screen while I provide a brief introduction. Neil Fisher is the team leader of the Integrated Planning Unit within Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Neil has worked for over 2 decades with the Fish and Fish Habitat Program in Fisheries and Oceans Canada, where he led the development of many national policies, guides, and tools, including legislative changes to the Fisheries Act in 2012 and 2019. And Neil, I see that you're all good to go, so the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Sharon. And thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you again. My name is Neil Fisher, and I'm the Integrated Planning Unit Lead for the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program in the Ontario and Prairie region. I'd like to say integrated planning was, as a work unit, was reinitiated within the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program in 2019, but it's not a new program idea. We actually had an integrated planning chapter in our habitat policy back in 1986. And so the idea has been around for a long time. So we're happy to be up and running and able to present to you today. Today, I'm going to speak to you about conservation, protection, and restoration planning. As an outline for my presentation, I'm going to use these 4 objectives and priorities that are guiding our work for the near future. First, I'm going to speak to the work on this that we'll be doing this year to identify regional restoration priorities. The context for this work is embedded within our role to facilitate broader fish and fish habitat conservation, protection, and restoration programming that I'm also going to outline in this presentation. Essential to any planning process is effective engagement with partners and stakeholders. And underpinning this is the Government of Canada's commitment to building renewed relationships with Indigenous peoples. Then I'll briefly touch on how we're planning to address cumulative effects and highlight some recent advice published by DFO Science. And then the last point here refers to the engagement, collaboration, and coordination role we have internally within DFO to work effectively with our colleagues in programs and work units. But that's about all I'll say about that today. We're just one small work unit within Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program in a broader sector called aquatic ecosystems. So there's a lot of, and you saw the presentation from our colleague yesterday who gave us a presentation on species at risk, Sean Staten. Thank you, Sean. As I hope many of you will know, the National Restoration Framework was just published in February, following over a year-long process of engagement on the talkfishhabitat.ca. That's our web platform, and where we received input nationally on how to identify restoration priorities. One of our work objectives for this year is to take this framework and engage regionally. So we have decided that for Ontario, it'd be a good idea to break this task down into a little bit more manageable scale, and we'll be focusing on the Lake Erie watershed. Doesn't mean everything else is going to be off the table, just be a quick focus here, but we'll be getting to the rest of the province over time. Understanding that as restoration actions are completed and new priorities come up, the plan needs to be adaptive. So it's within the context of the conservation, protection, and restoration planning process that will keep the regional restoration priorities updated and relevant. Here's a quick peek inside the cover of the restoration framework, outlining the approach to identifying restoration priorities. I encourage you to take a look at the final product that maybe you provided input on over a year ago. So to conservation, protection, and restoration planning, we've been saying a lot about that today. Here is a diagram of how DFO frames conservation, protection, and restoration planning. There's nothing really exciting or even new about it. It aligns with most other types of integrated resource planning processes. For our work, we'll be tasked to incorporate conservation objectives into freshwater aquatic ecosystem planning initiatives. We'll be focusing engagement with partners to identify priorities and objectives for fish and fish habitat. We'll be participating in planning processes led by others and leading our own conservation and protection and restoration planning process that focuses on our departmental roles and responsibilities. We're going to need to figure out how to integrate both ways and share information. And also, Sharon mentioned in the introduction, we assess and report on state of fish and fish habitat. So we have some reports that will hopefully be published later this year. They're fairly high level, but it's not the only place where we assess and report on state of fish and fish habitat. Part of what we do includes collaborating on initiatives like the Baseline Habitat Survey, where we use that information as well. The place where most people start on this wheel is collecting information on fish and fish habitat. Because we want to have a good sense of where we're at before we're engaging with partners. I think there's maybe a general expectation that the government knows what's going on, whether that's warranted or not. But you don't have to look very hard to find a plethora of information sources. There's technical reports, research publications, management plans, community-based and government program databases, etc. And more, the availability and consideration of Indigenous knowledge is needed. The work we'll be starting will be on identifying restoration priorities. Is one of the many priority identification initiatives that's going on. Just look at any one of these. There's priorities embedded within these processes. I want to clarify that we'll be continuing to support other initiatives as well, not just leading on our own, but supporting others, and commitments such as this to the Baseline Habitat Survey, allowing us to incorporate this information and priorities into our planning process. I'll also quickly mention that in addition to many sources of information I just showed, we also use the Canada Nature Fund for species at risk analysis of key focal areas for species at risk, initially established in 2018, and it was again expanded in 2021. Richard also showed this diagram, so there's definitely some integration going on or sharing of information. Priority threats and species places were selected based on four main criteria. First, the presence of aquatic species at risk, some of the key threats, including potential for these threats to be mitigated. And another criteria was the potential for multiple species and ecosystem level benefits of stewardship actions. And Sean Staten provided an example yesterday on ecosystem approach to recovery of species at risk in areas of the Great Lakes. And then last criteria is the potential for collaborators, partners, and applicants to work together to achieve conservation objectives. With so many sources of information highlighting priorities and indicators that point in the same direction, not surprisingly, our region, Ontario and Prairie region, is planning to start conservation, protection, and restoration planning in the east slopes of the Rockies. And within the lower Great Lakes, we are targeting Lake Erie watershed. As part of collecting information on biological physical environment, it's also important to understand the pressures and threats, such as changes in flows, alteration of hydrology by dams and barriers, shoreline modifications that can disrupt natural coastal processes that are important for maintaining habitats, habitat degradation and loss from water management infrastructure, urban development, land use activities, the introduction and establishment of aquatic invasive species that can lead to degradation of habitat conditions and water quality. There's also activities such as commercial and recreational fishing and fish mortality potentially caused by other activities. And then there's also other declines in water quality from sediment and other pollutants from point and non-point sources. And last but not least, importantly, actually, the effects and influence of climate change on our ecosystems. Collecting information takes a lot of hard work and expertise. And then once you have that information, so what? What do we do with it? Identifying priorities and objectives is no easy task either. Because even when these are priorities, objectives are written down, and as in many of the reports I just showed, they can be interpreted differently. They may not be readily available, or we might not be aware they're available, or in worst case scenario, they might be dismissed because maybe those objectives didn't consider other perspectives. So how do we have any confidence to begin implementing measures? Well, I would start with the fact that we have a regulatory program that provides authorizations for projects that impact fish habitat, or potentially species at risk. And those are the easy ones. That's mandatory. There's also funding programs as a measure that enable actions aligned with government priorities. And Richard just mentioned a couple that are coming up. But what about the difficult issues where there's competing or opposed objectives and interest? That's where engagement, consultation, cooperation, planning, and more engagement are needed. So where to next? Where are we on this planning wheel? Well, as I already mentioned, we're beginning with an engagement process focusing on priority places, species, and threats, and then focusing even more on establishing, getting input and engagement on identifying restoration priorities. We want to work with partners and stakeholders to coordinate our efforts. And ultimately, this will help us to address cumulative effects. With the information and support for our plans, we can make recommendations for how DFO program tools and efforts can support plan objectives. I wanted to quickly mention that while I've been talking about starting on conservation, protection, and restoration planning in Lake Erie watershed, it is not without consideration of the existing governance structures, relationships, and networks that are already in place. There's a long history of regional and international cooperation that we'll want to build from. Many times we've heard about Canada-Ontario Agreement, Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, State of the Great Lakes Reporting, Lake-wide Action and Management Planning, and more recently, the Baseline Habitat Survey and our support for the Coastal Resilience Framework. We're already working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Ontario government, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and many others on these and other initiatives. We'll continue to collaborate and incorporate outcomes and the information and knowledge gained and setting of objectives and priorities through these processes into our priorities. So this is getting back to what Richard was talking about. How do we work together? So we're committing that we're not just leading this stuff, we're also supporting others as well towards our achieving our mutual objectives. At the beginning of the presentation, I highlighted one of our objectives and priorities was to figure out how to manage cumulative effects. This is a much longer discussion that I and my team hope to have with many of you over time. But if I can just take a moment to highlight this research document on cumulative effects consideration for integrated planning. It was recently published last December and is now publicly available on the CSAS website. CSAS is Canadian Science Advice Secretariat. The science report provides a lot more detail. I'm just going to say that these research documents underpin our planning approach. For Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program to integrate integrated planning into their policy processes, we need to consider the elements of an integrated plan, some of which are not science-based. So clear linkages to the plan and the policy allow for evaluation of our effectiveness and given those specific targets. Just leaving that, I could probably speak, that'll be more discussion on cumulative effects. So thank you very much, Sharon and everybody.
Thanks, Neil. We actually have time for a few quick questions, if you don't mind. So thanks for the excellent presentation, Neil. Neil, you mentioned that you're in the engagement phase right now. A member of the audience is wondering if you have engaged or will be engaging the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and other agencies and organizations through this process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've actually been invited to work with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and I'll say informally at this point. So it's definitely on the list of people to engage.
Wonderful. And through the Conservation, Protection, and Restoration Planning Framework for Fish and Fish Habitat, Neil, how do you hope to see this framework support Indigenous-led conservation?
That's a good question that we've given a lot of thought to, Sharon. I highlighted in there that there's a lot of existing, in my presentation, existing governance and structures, coordination that's going on in the landscape. One area that we've identified as needing more attention is to engage with Indigenous communities and groups. And that is when we go out to begin engagement, we'll be starting there. And then we'll be able to build off of the existing relationships and networks to bring it all together. So, you can expect that we'll be reaching out sometime in the later spring, early summer, and then hopefully continuing the discussion later on this fall.
Wonderful. That's great. Thanks, Neil. And last question to you is, how will climate change and climate resilience be integrated into this framework?
Yeah, we have research scientists working on that. We're contributing to that cumulative effects paper that I show and others that are helping us to understand what we might be able to project or anticipate from the climate change within modeling. So we'll have some ideas to share on what we could expect to see. And then that becomes a part of the uncertainty and variability that we'll need to work with in the planning process.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Neil. And now we will be switching over to our first set of guest presenters of the day. First up is Robin. Robin, please go ahead and share your screen while I provide a brief introduction. Robin Rumney serves as the Ontario Key Biodiversity Area Regional Coordinator at Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. Robin's work involves researching Ontario's biodiversity and collaboratively proposing key biodiversity areas that are critical to the maintenance of wildlife and biodiversity. Welcome, Robin. I see that you're ready to go, so I'll pass the floor now to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sharon. Thanks so much for the introduction and also for the opportunity to share some of our work here today. So Sharon mentioned I'm with the Wildlife Conservation Society, or WCS Canada, and I'm here to talk about key biodiversity areas today and how they can be used to support Great Lakes coastal wetland conservation. So key biodiversity areas are sites that contribute significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. So key biodiversity areas, or KBAs as we call them, provide a standardized approach to identify and map the most important places for global and national conservation efforts. And some of these sites include some of the Great Lakes coastal wetlands. So today in my presentation, I'm going to give an overview and some background on the KBA program, and then dive into some of the methods and results we found for Southern Ontario and also for some of the Great Lakes coastal wetlands in particular. So what exactly are these key biodiversity areas, or KBAs? So these are sites that are key to preventing species or ecosystem extirpation or extinction. So one example of one type of KBA could be a site that holds high concentrations of rare or at-risk species, one or more, compared to the global or national total. So for example, one of these sites could hold 10% of a national population of a single turtle species. So if this site were to be disturbed or destroyed, this could put the national or even global population of this species at risk of extirpation or extinction. The goal of the KBA project is to create a data set of complementary biodiversity knowledge. And we're hopeful that this data set can help enhance decision-making and planning and help with things like protected areas design, land use planning, environmental assessments, and community science initiatives. There's no management prescription for these KBAs, which means they don't automatically become a protected area or have any sort of management or stewardship put onto them. And it also means that they can be nominated across all land use types, including in urban areas, in areas used for agriculture or mining, and also in existing protected areas. So we're looking to identify KBAs in Canada as a result of Canadian biodiversity being in decline. So we believe that protected area placement really does need to prioritize biodiversity. And with the federal government committing to 30 by 30, looking to protect 30% of the country by 2030, we have a need for new protected areas in Canada. And we see the role of KBAs here in helping choose which areas could potentially become protected or managed in some way to help protect biodiversity. So KBAs are seen as a scientifically robust and credible tool that can help tell us where these sites with high important biodiversity values are, and in doing so inform conservation decisions. Our approach to KBAs is first of all collaborative. So I'll say here that I didn't include the full network of all the partners on this project, but it's much broader than just my organization. So we work closely with Birds Canada and NatureServe Canada. And then we also have a large network of governments, First Nations, and other environmental NGOs and experts who are really involved in this KBA process. And it works at both a global scale with the International Union of Conservation of Nature, and as well at a national scale with some of the groups I just mentioned. So it's very involved with the many different parties, and Indigenous knowledge holders are engaged throughout the process. And we have 2 stages of review. So we really are trying to work with other groups and make sure what we're finding supports what the conservation community, others in the community also know. Our approach is also comprehensive. So we're trying to identify the full set of KBAs across Canada. We're working at a regional scale. So my work is focused in Ontario, and we have similar coordinators across WCS Canada and Birds Canada working across the country. We're looking for KBAs for both species and ecosystem criteria. My results today will focus on the species side of things because that's what I'm working on. But all of this is as permitted by data availability, because rather than conducting fieldwork from scratch across the country, we're working with our large network of partners and other groups who have been willing and able to share data and knowledge to make this all possible. And our approach, we also want it to be relevant. So we're not trying to create the one and only conservation designation. We're trying to work with the existing designations and work that's being led and has been led across the country. and make sure that this complements it. So the KBA work is based off of 2 documents that really guide our work in an unbiased way. So we have a global standard that's laid out by the IUCN, and then we've also adopted this at a national scale. And these standards outline 5 broad criteria that tell us where KBA should be. So we could have KBAs for threatened biodiversity. So these are at-risk species and ecosystems that are listed by groups like COSEWIC, IUCN, or NatureServe as being at risk. We could have KBAs for geographically restricted biodiversity. So these are species and ecosystems that might not be at risk, but because they're spatially concentrated, if a site were to be disturbed, this could impact the whole population or species or ecosystem. We're also looking for sites with high ecological integrity, but this is still in the works for how this would work in Canada. Sites important to biological processes, such as for birds, this is migration and staging grounds, breeding and other things. And finally, looking for sites that are irreplaceable, but again, still early in the process for this. So in the Great Lakes coastal wetlands, what we've done is we've narrowed down a list of all species that could meet any of these KBA criteria I just mentioned. And we're working across all taxa. So there's no sort of species or population or designatable unit that isn't considered. But we narrow down the list looking for things that are at risk or geographically restricted or concentrate for breeding or migration. So we're looking at plants like American water willow, fish like spotted gar. Birds Canada is leading the work for all sorts of bird species. And then we're looking for reptiles and amphibians. So pictured here is spiny softshell. So this is one just example of a reptile that we might be looking for in the Great Lakes coastal wetland sites to trigger KBAs. And then we go back to our criteria to figure out how much of a species or ecosystem again, but here species we need at a site to meet KBA thresholds. And then we'll use things like the Environment and Climate Change Canada range maps in consultation with experts and other conservation groups to figure out where these criteria are met for each species. So when we do these calculations across the Great Lakes coastal wetlands, we found potentially to date 8 different KBAs. And these are just KBAs that are directly right on the Great Lakes coast with a wetland in them. This list might be a bit larger if we broaden it. And what's really neat here is the high number of candidate KBA, what we call trigger species. So the species that could meet KBA thresholds at these sites. So for a site to meet KBA criteria, we need 1 or more species to meet the criteria. So it's really, really neat to see some of these Great Lake coastal wetlands, for example, Long Point, have upwards of 30 KBA trigger species. So just wanted to note that our results are basically finding that these sites are really important across the board for many different rare and at-risk species. I just want to say as well that the KBAs aren't ranked by how many candidate trigger species or total trigger species they have. So all of these sites, if they meet KBA criteria, would have equal standing in the KBA designation. It's just interesting to see the really high species diversity in some of these KBA trigger species diversity in some of these sites. So when we map this out across Southern Ontario on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes, we have upwards of 80 candidate KBAs. So these are the orange dots on the map. What's exciting here as well is I shared something similar last year, but this year we have some officially nominated KBAs to share. So the green polygons on the map are the sites that have officially completed the KBA designation process. So sites like Canadian Lake Superior. And as well, the orange candidate sites, these are still subject to change until all of the reviews are done. So we could expect this to change. But we're finding a lot of KBAs in the south of the province around the Great Lakes. So one of these KBAs is the Long Point Peninsula and Marsh. So this is one of our first officially nominated KBAs in the province. And this is an important bird area or an IBA. So Birds Canada has led this nomination, and they found a lot of the birds that triggered the important bird area also meet KBA criteria at the site. So we're really excited about this one. And then we also noticed that a lot of the other taxa at the site could meet KBA criteria. So the graph on the right shows the different COSEWIC listed species that are endangered, threatened, or special concern, and how they really do range across a variety of taxa. And this is just one way that we look for KBA trigger species. We're also finding things like we have a sedge called broadwing sedge that we're looking at the site, and it's not listed by COSEWIC, but we're potentially finding that it's only been found at the country at Long Point, so that would meet our KBA criteria. As well, things like Fowler's toad are potentially going to be added to this KBA nomination, and warmouth as well for fish. Another officially nominated KBA in the Great Lakes coastal wetlands is the Leslie Street Spit. So this is a neat site right downtown Toronto, a man-made spit that goes out into Lake Ontario with some wetlands in embayments. So this is another important bird area, and Birds Canada has found a few different species of birds. I believe it's 5 in this case, do meet KBA criteria. And we've also been working with some of the partners at the site to see if any of the plants or insects or turtles or anything else could meet criteria. They were all below our specific thresholds, but I still think it's neat to highlight that even though the site is just technically a KBA for birds, it still provides refuge for a lot of other different taxa at the site, and we can still recognize these in our KBA information. Another site that we're working on is Eastern Lake St. Clair. So this is a candidate KBA. So it's still subject to change, but it's an important bird area, or IBA, that Birds Canada found to be globally and nationally significant for a lot of different bird species. And when we went in to look to see what else was there, we found a variety of rare freshwater fish like channel darter, eastern sand darter, and a bunch of different freshwater mussel species, including eastern pond mussel, which could potentially have a high population in this area. So for this site, we're doing consultation to work with Walpole Island First Nation, who has done a lot of stewardship and management all along this part of the province. So we're waiting to move forward with this nomination once we hear confirmation from them, but we're really looking forward to nominating the site because it has a potentially really high species richness and biodiversity. And the last example site I wanted to share was the Dundas Valley and Dundas Marsh candidate KBA. So this is another important bird area, so all of these are. So we're working with Birds Canada again to see what birds and then other species could meet KBA criteria. So Birds Canada has found birds like rusty blackbird could meet global KBA criteria. And then we're looking to add things like lilliput, which is a rare freshwater mussel, and other plants and salamanders that are in the uplands there as well. And this has been a really neat nomination process because there's a very active conservation community. There is at all of these sites. But at this site, we're working with the Coots to Escarpment Eco Park system and all of their various partners. So this is still in the works, but we're looking forward to continuing that nomination. So for more information on all of the KBA research methods, the research papers that have come out of this, the different standards I was referring to, the different thresholds that we're looking for each species, please check out our website at kbacanada.org. So we just had a new website that was released in the fall. So it's quite comprehensive with information. As well, an exciting part of the website is we have a new KBA registry, which is the map that shows you where the KBAs are, including the green officially nominated sites and then the orange dots for the candidate sites. So as I mentioned before, this map will continue to change. But once KBAs across the country are nominated, we're really hopeful that this data can be shared and can be used to identify priority sites for conservation, guide stewardship and management of protected areas, Indigenous protected conserved areas, and other effective area-based conservation measures. We're hopeful that it can support private sector decision-making, provide focus for the work of environmental NGOs, and just acknowledge sites important for biodiversity conservation that currently lack recognition. And as well, a really important aspect of this is just to celebrate the conservation successes. So all of the sites I mentioned today in the Great Lakes Coastal Wetlands have really active conservation groups and stewardship and management groups already working there. So that's why we're able to find so many KBA triggers at these sites today. So just one other way to kind of celebrate, not suggest that anything in particular needs to happen, but acknowledge what has already happened. And yeah, thank you very much. If you do want to get in touch about this, it's quite a collaborative process. So please feel free to reach out to me by email, or again, just check out our website.
Wonderful. Thank you for the excellent presentation, Robin. We received lots of great reactions from the audience, so thank you as well. We'll be saving questions for Robin until after Jocelyn and Heather's presentations. So I will now invite Jocelyn to please go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready, while I provide a brief introduction. Jocelyn Sherwood is a geospatial analyst with the Great Lakes Ecosystem Management section in Environment and Climate Change Canada. In this role, Jocelyn coordinates the integration of ecological and stressor-based data to inform decisions and priorities for freshwater management. Jocelyn, please go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready.
Great. Okay, thanks, Sharon, very much for the introduction. As Sharon said, I'm with Environment and Climate Change Canada within the Great Lakes Ecosystem Management Group. So the same group that led the charge for the baseline habitat survey. And while that focused kind of on the 2-kilometer terrestrial coastal margin, I'm going to kind of jump into the lake and speak to identifying areas of high ecological value in the nearshore. So this work really focuses on the area of the lake where much of us interact. You know, we fish, we swim, we boat in the nearshore, and unfortunately, Canadian Great Lakes nearshore waters are under stress. So although efforts to protect and restore the Great Lakes have largely been successful since the first signing of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, I guess 50 years ago, many nearshore areas continue to be degraded from a variety of stressors. So many of you have probably seen this map before. The result of Environment and Climate Change Canada's recent overall assessment of the state of nearshore waters. And with the different colors, the green, yellow, orange, and red delineated on the nearshore, we see varying levels of stress. So the cumulative impact of nuisance and harmful algae, contaminants in water and sediment, restrictions to human use, and impaired coastal processes is really inhibiting the ability of the nearshore to adapt not only to natural variations, but also to emerging threats and pressures. So while we know that there are areas under high, moderate, and low stress, we also know that many nearshore areas retain significant biodiversity and ecological value. So ensuring that we're prioritizing restoration and protection efforts in these areas of high ecological value that also may be under high stress is really, really important. And that's why Environment and Climate Change Canada initiated this effort to develop and implement a methodology for identifying areas of high ecological value in the nearshore. So you may be thinking to yourself, hasn't this been done already? And of course, over the last 30 years, there's been lots of work to identify such areas. I mean, Robin just gave an excellent presentation on one such effort. And so this is not meant to repeat or replace such work, but rather to add value. So this effort is adding value kind of in 3 ways. The first is by updating available information. The second is to provide a multidisciplinary perspective. And then finally, to develop information to support the establishment of priorities specifically for nearshore prevention, restoration, and protection. I think that many of you would probably agree that freshwater conservation is perhaps a little bit behind terrestrial conservation planning. So this effort was really meant to kind of push that needle forward. So the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement commits Canada to implementing a nearshore framework, which, in addition to identifying areas of high stress, which we saw on the previous map, also sets out to identify areas that are of high ecological value to determine factors causing stress or threatening these areas, and to establish priorities for taking action. So how did we go about doing this? In a nutshell, we established an advisory group of Great Lakes partners in order to ensure that the effort would be supported by a range of stakeholders. We conducted a pretty extensive literature review in order to gain a better understanding of existing work. We defined high ecological value in the context of the Great Lakes nearshore, and then we conducted lake-specific workshops that were really meant for participants to come to consensus on the areas. So on the right side of the slide, you can see the most commonly cited biophysical characteristics that were identified in most of the initiatives that we looked at in the literature review. So the advisory group agreed that these should be the basis for defining areas of high ecological value. And then additional consideration should be given to socioeconomic and cultural significance, as well as to threats. So with that in mind, 64 areas of high ecological value were identified across the Canadian Great Lakes nearshore waters. 7 of these areas contain all 8 of the biophysical attributes listed on the previous slide, and also contain socioeconomic and cultural importance. So the distinct areas were delineated through kind of a collaborative mapping exercise from a diverse range of participants on each lake. So participants were given a blank map and asked to literally draw areas on the map where they thought that at least one of the biophysical attributes existed. And then they were asked to provide contextual narrative for each of those attributes. So there was no consideration to scale. The areas could be as small or as large as the participant wanted. And then the size of these areas were discussed, and in many cases, they were modified throughout the lake-specific workshops. So there was also no consideration for whether the area was already under some level of protection. So provincial and national parks, for example, were not necessarily excluded or intentionally included. So almost without exception, all of the areas identified by the participants shared 5 of the same biophysical characteristics. They contained unique or rare features, and in most cases, those were habitat features. So, unique dunes, coastal wetlands, that sort of thing. They were important for species life stages, and in particular for spawning for various fish species. They contain species at risk, and they also contain socioeconomic importance and cultural or historic value. So the results really do reflect similarities, and in some cases directly overlap with areas identified in other efforts, such as in various biodiversity conservation strategies. And as probably expected, there was nearly unanimous agreement on well-known sites such as Long Point and Point Pelee and other provincial parks. So before I move on, I'd just like to emphasize that these areas are subjective. They reflect consensus amongst participants, and they're meant to be reevaluated on perhaps a 5-year basis, but that is subject to discussion. These areas are really meant to start a larger discussion amongst Great Lakes partners on identifying priority habitats for protection and restoration. So they don't imply any official designation, and they don't have policy implications. So I'm going to go over some of the lake-specific results in pretty high detail, but detailed results are available online if you'd like to have more information. So there's 5 Great Lakes, 1 Superior, might as well start there. 13 areas of high ecological value were identified on Lake Superior. They range from river mouths to larger embayments, such as Black Bay, where, as we know from the results of the Habitat Baseline Survey, much of Lake Superior's coastal wetlands are found. The least populated of the Canadian Great Lakes, we only had 7 participants, but they brought a really diverse range of perspectives to the workshop. Many of the participants have spent their entire lives working on the lake, and they had really valuable observations on changes in the nearshore over the last decades, particularly related to climate change. So not surprisingly, many of the areas contain spawning habitat for several fish species, high levels of naturalness, and rare species, including some subarctic and alpine species. So on Lake Huron, we have 15 areas of high ecological value delineated, and we had 16 participants. So the largest number of participants for the workshop. A lot of the discussion on Lake Huron really focused on scale. So what's the best resolution to identify these areas at? And some of the proposed areas were pretty large, such as the entirety of Eastern Georgian Bay. And the participants debated the relevance of delineating such a large area if the intended outcome is to better prioritize specific actions. So this led to more discussion around connectivity. Should areas with extensive coastal wetland complexes be lumped into one large area, or should they be split up using features like river mouths? So in the end, we have both large and small areas, and some extend across wetland complexes, and some are delineated at a finer resolution in order to capture unique features like the Bird's Foot Delta at the Mississauga River. So regardless of the boundaries that you see here on the map, no matter if you're on team lump or team split, different users of this information will assign different weights and priorities depending on their interests. And that's really the purpose of identifying these areas. So on Lake Huron, on Lake Erie, including the connecting channels, so 14 areas were identified. A big point of discussion on the Lake Erie workshop was that of geodiversity. So the participants really emphasized the importance of capturing processes as well as particular places. So it was noted that Lake Erie's longshore sediment transport, for example, is an essential process for maintaining sand spit features like Long Point and Turkey Point. And so rather than identifying each feature separately, areas that are functionally related were grouped to capture this connectivity. So this is what we see in the Port Glasgow to Port Burwell area. And many of the areas that were identified, Eastern Lake St. Clair, Rondo, Point Pelee, Long Point, contain important coastal wetlands. They support species at risk, and they are likely very important for maintaining nearshore resilience in the face of climate change. So the last map, 22 areas of high ecological value were identified in Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. With a few exceptions, you can see that the areas are relatively smaller than those on the other lakes. And it's probably not surprising given the population of Lake Ontario, but it is interesting that we had the most number of areas identified. So the St. Lawrence River was included, and you can see in the inset map that there's 4 areas identified along it. But it's worth pointing out that although there is extensive shoreline development, and particularly on the western end of the lake, the nearshore does retain significant ecological value. So participants emphasized the potential for climate change to alter weather patterns and water levels, and therefore affect coastal habitats and the human use of the nearshore. And this was reflected in the final areas delineated on the map. So rather than identifying many small pockets of coastal wetlands, for example, near the mouth of the Niagara River, participants really suggested grouping them into a single polygon, which you see reflected in the Niagara Peninsula coastal marshes, and then also in the Durham region coastal wetlands. And the intention here being to encourage interested agencies and organizations that manage the area to recognize functional similarities. So we've mapped these areas. Now what? How do we use this information to establish nearshore priorities for protection and restoration and make sure that we're doing the right work in the right place? So, nearshore processes, habitats, and species exist at multiple scales, both spatially and temporally, which makes it important for us as stewards of the nearshore to think spatially across organizations. I like this term geo-collaboration. I think a multiple lens or multidisciplinary approach for informing these complex questions, like where should we work and what action do we need to take, really requires us to collaborate geospatially. So integrating data across multiple scales for greater insights and visualization in order to support priorities. Because as they say, without good data, you can't make good decisions. So we have good data by overlaying areas of high ecological value with nearshore areas under moderate or high stress. We can better understand what types of protection or restoration efforts may be required. So in the example here, we can see that we might want to give consideration to activities that have impacts on coastal processes. The McGregor Point to Goderich area of high ecological value, seen here in blue, is also an area of moderate cumulative stress in the nearshore. So we can look at various data at multiple scales and draw attention to areas of high ecological value in need of protection because they overlap with areas under stress. And on a larger scale, such as along the north shore of Lake Erie, we can integrate various data sets to establish priorities across processes. We can integrate the results from the baseline habitat survey in order to establish priorities that may, for example, preserve geodiversity in littoral cells. So supporting actions that mitigate the impacts of shore perpendicular structures, for example, that trap sediment and restrict transport to Long Point or Rondo. So the Great Lakes are big, and identifying priority habitats for protection along 8,500 kilometers of Canadian coastline is really no small feat. Ensuring that we know where we need to work and what we need to do means that we need to work together. We need sound science, data-informed decisions, and geo-collaboration. So these are just a couple of resources. The only way to integrate our data is to make it available to the public. So I've included some resources here for accessing our technical methodology report, as well as our spatial data, and for those who are interested, our lake-specific nearshore assessments. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the excellent presentation, Jocelyn. And once again, we'll be saving questions for you after Heather's presentation. So next, I'd like to call on Heather to join us. Heather Braun is acting head of the stewardship unit for the Canadian Wildlife Service Ontario region. She leads a team to implement conservation actions for species at risk and other wildlife through programs such as Priority Place, the Ecological Gifts Program, and the Indigenous Partnerships Initiative. And Heather, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks for having me here today. I'm Heather Braun with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and I'll be talking about our Priority Place conservation activities in the Long Point Walsingham Forest area, as well as in the Carolinian zone of Southern Ontario. To start, I will provide a bit of a background on the Canadian Wildlife Service, and then what is called the Pan-Canadian approach to transforming species at risk conservation. I'll talk a little bit about what a priority place is, and then dig into what we're doing in the Long Point Walsingham Forest Priority Place, as well as in our plans to expand into the Carolinian zone. So the Canadian Wildlife Service is a branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. We've been around for a long time. Our mandate has changed historically from initially a focus on migratory birds, and we still have that focus to protect and conserve Canada's wildlife and habitats. And we also have a mandate to recover terrestrial species at risk. I'm going to highlight the term terrestrial there because when we do talk about species at risk, there's lots of them around, and for the Canadian Wildlife Service, we focus on those that are terrestrial. I'll note also in this graphic, you can see that in addition to species at risk and wildlife and habitat, there's additional emphasis that's been placed on Indigenous engagement toward reconciliation. And so that's something that we really take to heart at Canadian Wildlife Service, and that we're hoping to grow as we continue to work within our priority places. The Pan-Canadian approach to species at risk conservation is a federal, provincial, and territorial agreement to transform the approach for species at risk and biodiversity conservation. So this came about in about 2017, and it was a fundamental shift in the way that species at risk conservation was going to be conducted, from a single species approach to multi-species and a more ecosystem-based approach. And so we would have more targeted and collaborative actions based on shared priority places, priority species, and threats. There's also an increased effort on implementing actions that achieve meaningful outcomes for species at risk. Just a little bit about that. It's somewhat intuitive, but through our work, we are obligated to implement recovery plans for species at risk, terrestrial species at risk. Clearly, multiple species can benefit from independent restoration actions. And so this ecosystem-based approach has the potential to accelerate the recovery of multiple species at risk. And so the Pan-Canadian approach, emphasis on priority places, is one way to help us conduct actions that address recovery strategies for multiple species. We recognize that we're working on a landscape scale, of course, and so then this collaboration from partners doing related or similar work is really important. So what is a priority place? Priority places are areas that have been identified across the country for their high biodiversity value and their conservation status. There have been 11 identified across the Canadian Wildlife Service, and in Ontario, our focus is in Southern Ontario in the Long Point region. This area was identified because of its high biodiversity value, as well as a concentration of conservation-minded partners who were similarly engaged in conservation activities and really had the capacity to receive funding and implement conservation actions in a relatively timely fashion. The Long Point Walsingham Forest Priority Place was developed based on the Canadian Wildlife Service's Biodiversity Atlas, again selected for its high biodiversity value and the availability of that conservation community, as well as significant threats. I believe we have identified 88 species at risk just within this smaller geographic area. Unlike many of the other priority places in Ontario, we chose a relatively small geographic area. This was intentional, as we wanted to be able to demonstrate that the work we could do would have those direct benefits to species at risk, and then could be scaled up once we had that sort of proof of concept. The priority place process uses the conservation standards, or the open standards, for the practice of conservation. Conservation standards provide a framework to help us implement adaptive management and can demonstrate that our conservation actions are producing the results that we're looking for on the ground. In terms of our progress in Long Point, again, we initiated the work in 2017. We've engaged more than 30 partners in this process through initial planning workshops, development of a conservation and implementation plan, which has gone through a couple of iterations. In total, we identified 6 conservation targets to impact 88 species at risk. These conservation targets include things like forested swamps, coastal wetlands, open country, amphibians, and reptiles. We also identified 4 key threats, and threats are those things that are impacting our conservation targets. So these include things like Phragmites and invasive species, fire suppression, agricultural runoff, and roads. The plan also includes 16 strategies. These are primarily habitat and improvement related activities to address the threats and ultimately the conservation targets. Since we started providing funding in fiscal year 2018-19, we have led 17 different projects with 13 different partners and almost $5 million of federal funding, which has been matched generally 1-to-1. We have about 76 species that have been impacted through the conservation of 6,600 hectares and the protection of almost 2,000 hectares. And so the types of activities we're doing will include things like invasive species management, like controlled burns, habitat restoration within open country, et cetera. So again, we've been doing this now for 5 years, and we wanted to expand our work to cover a greater area within Southern Ontario. And so we're looking at the Carolinian zone. And the reasons for expanding are generally that we want to achieve greater outcomes for species at risk and their habitat. We want to increase the number of partners that can be involved in this process. And we also know that there's a greater opportunity to engage with Indigenous people throughout this region. And so we're calling this the Carolinian Zone Conservation Implementation Plan. Our effort is to be collaborative and to work with levels of government, Indigenous people, and other conservation partners to develop and implement a conservation implementation plan that has goals, strategies, and actions to conserve species at risk, other important species and their habitat, that integrates Indigenous priorities and interests into the Carolinian zone, and it provides funding for implementation. And again, we'll use that conservation standards framework to ensure that we're being accountable, we're being directed, and we're able to do that sort of adaptive management as we go along. Considerations for this work. Clearly, the Carolinian zone is very large. We are not going to be able to implement conservation actions throughout the Carolinian zone on an equal level. And so we need to prioritize and focus our efforts in order to have those meaningful outcomes. We do have funding available through implementation as of April 2023. So we're in the process of negotiating funding agreements with some partners. I'll talk about that more in a second. We also have limited time available for planning. And I can imagine there's planners on the call right now who are a little astounded by the pace at which we're planning to do this. We don't have a plan and already we're rolling out money. But clearly there has been a lot of planning conducted in the Carolinian zone to date, and we will be using that information to inform our decisions. In terms of our engagement to date, we started some internal work at the end of November in 2021, and then really started engaging our partners in 2022. We've had a couple of key planning meetings. We're also holding workshops with Indigenous communities within the region to ensure that those voices are here and to enhance and improve CWS's Indigenous engagement overall. There are 4 steps right now that we're working on to address this plan. The first is that we have developed some preliminary assessment criteria. So our objectives, of course, are driven by species at risk. We are using existing conservation plans and other action plans in the region to inform a lot of our understanding of needs. We are providing capacity for implementation, and we're also vetting all of this with the input of about 25 different partners. We have also identified our conservation targets and threats. Again, our targets are those things that we want to conserve, and the threats are those things that impact those targets. And so things like beaches and coastal dunes, forests and treed swamps, open country, wetlands, amphibians and reptiles, water courses and riparian areas. And the pressures that impact those things include things like invasive species, like not being able to have historic controlled burns and those sorts of things. We also completed a threat assessment for our conservation targets. And we are now in the process of conducting a data analysis exercise to help us identify where the species at risk are, where that critical habitat is, overlaid with where our conservation target hotspots are. And so this will help us to identify where conservation actions can take place that will have the greatest impact for species at risk. So just to zoom in a little bit on a couple areas, we see some areas near the Pinery, as well as some areas in Windsor. This pertains specifically to the open country conservation target, but we'll be doing the same exercise for all of our conservation targets. So next steps for us. The Long Point Walsingham Forest is part of the Carolinian Zone, and we will continue to work with partners to implement its conservation plan through 2026. We're now in the process of finalizing our implementation report. And one really exciting piece of that is making the connection to the habitat restoration activities we're doing and the recovery plans for species at risk to really see the impact of this work and its influence on species at risk recovery. For the Carolinian Zone, our goal is to finalize the first iteration of the implementation plan by late summer 2023. This means that we've got to refine those targets, where those nested SAR, support identification of key areas to work within, and then identify strategies and actions associated with each conservation target. We will continue to engage with our conservation partners in a collaborative way, and we will continue to engage with Indigenous peoples. I think in addition to funding restoration and conservation activities, we also want to identify the conservation priorities of Indigenous peoples and their perspectives, and then help to support and build capacity within those communities to address their interests and then lead to stewardship amongst those communities. We will be tracking projects through 2026, and then of course, reporting on actions that support SAR recovery. So that is my presentation for today. If you are interested in learning more, the Long Point Walsingham Forest Conservation Implementation Plan has a website associated with it. It's listed here and you can read all about it. Samantha Calabrese is our program manager for that effort. In the Carolinian Zone, Danielle Ullenbach is the lead. We do not have anything up online yet for that, but do feel free to reach out to either of those folks or to me if you have any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for the excellent presentation, Heather. I will now invite Robin and Jocelyn to rejoin us for a quick discussion. So to start off, do you see an opportunity to apply the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey results to help support your work, or any collaboration opportunities? Perhaps we'll go in order of the presentation. So starting with Robin first.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. That's a great question. We have been looking into using the data. I already have it downloaded. I just need to look into some of the how-tos. But basically for each of these key biodiversity areas or KBAs that we're looking at, we have to draw a boundary in space, and we want it to be ecologically meaningful and make sense from a management perspective. So these Great Lakes coastal habitat surveys are really, could be really useful for some of our shoreline sites. For example, we're trying to draw a boundary on Manitoulin Island where there's less conservation designations and things to start off. So having these really detailed coastal habitat mapping can give us a really great starting point for that.
Wonderful. Glad to hear, Robin. And Jocelyn, I know you already shared some example potential applications during your presentation of the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey. Just wondering if you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to overlap and integrate the baseline habitat survey with not only the areas of high ecological value, but like Robin said, the key biodiversity areas. And the benefit being that it's just an additional layer of information to help prioritize, for example, if you need to restore stream connectivity and you want to identify areas that have a particular land cover, you can use the baseline habitat survey to do so.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jocelyn. And Heather, any thoughts on potential applications?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we've spoken to Greg Main about this a little bit previously, just because we are in the process of doing our assessment. And so again, I think, while our focus is looking at the requirements for species at risk, understanding and having that data accessible to us will be very helpful.
Wonderful. Glad to hear. Thanks, Heather. Moving on to our next question is, I wonder if any of you have had any discussion about using your priority areas towards Canada's 30 by 30 target, whoever within the Government of Canada is setting those targets. Have any of you had discussions already? So perhaps starting with Robin again.
Yeah, so with KBAs, there's no, we're not suggesting that every KBA becomes some sort of protected or managed area or OECM that could feed into 30 by 30, but we are sharing the data, and we already have shared the data with some partners who could use this in the decision making. So we're hopeful that some of these KBAs could directly feed into finding new protected areas in a way that could protect biodiversity. But our agency itself would not be the ones creating those, but we're really hopeful that other groups who are doing that work can use our data.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robin. Jocelyn.
That's a good question. We haven't had specific conversations about using the areas of high ecological value towards 30 by 30 targets or the HE targets, but there's definitely a use for them, I think, perhaps in proposed national marine conservation areas, to understand what exactly is in the near shore, what the value of those areas are. So again, it's just an additional layer of information that I think does extend into that target realm. And we would be happy to have those conversations.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jocelyn. Heather.
So yes, the Canadian Wildlife Service is heavily involved in the 30 by 30. It falls under my shop within stewardship unit as well, and so is linked in to priority place work, as well as a lot of our other work that we have ongoing throughout both Southern and Northern Ontario. In line with that, I believe that our national wildlife areas have the ability now to expand their boundaries. And so those are also things that would contribute to the 30 by 30 mandate.
Wonderful. We're so glad, all of us, to connect over this virtual platform. And next question is, I believe all of you touched on this in your presentation, but I wonder if you can elaborate more or summarize how Indigenous knowledge is integrated into your work, or how your work can support Indigenous-led conservation. So again, starting with Robin first.
So part of the KBA process is reaching out to First Nations from the get-go. So we actually at this point have a dedicated staff member who works across the country, and then we're also working with some consultants in certain areas who already have relationships with First Nations. So we've reached out and notified First Nations just of the project, and hopefully anyone of interest can get involved. And we're willing to kind of let any First Nations lead the process in any way they want, but we're also willing to take the lead as needed because we have the time and resources for this. And I'll also say that there is potential that KBAs could help guide things like Indigenous protected and conserved areas down the road. So that would be depending on First Nations interests. But we are hopeful that we can continue different partnerships and building relationships moving forward.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robin. Jocelyn.
Yeah, well, the intention of these areas of high ecological value is really that the data can be used by anybody for various purposes. So depending on the particular interests of a group, so including First Nations. And we did have some input, some participation, especially on Lake Superior from First Nations perspective. So we, as much as possible, looked to include, particularly through the importance from the cultural value. But yeah, always looking for opportunities to incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems into our identification.
Great. Thanks, Jocelyn. Heather.
So yes, when we rolled out the Long Point Walsingham Forest Priority Place 5 or 6 years ago, we wanted to have Indigenous engagement in that process. And due to a whole host of reasons, including our own limited awareness, capacity, et cetera, we didn't get the sort of input, the sort of engagement that we wanted. We know that Indigenous communities have indicated to Canadian Wildlife Service in general that our engagement activities are not sufficient. We need to do more. And so since then, we have now hired an Indigenous engagement coordinator who works in collaboration with the team running the Priority Place. So intentionally, since we started working within the Priority Place, we have wanted to increase our engagement, to be more proactive, to better ensure that we're giving the right level of focus to Indigenous partners, and in a way that's in recognition of the fact that those partners have different capacities, have different perspectives on what it means to do conservation, what species at risk are. Just that approach needs to be heard and valued in the same way that the sort of Canadian Wildlife Service Western approach to conservation is being administered. And so right now, as I mentioned, like overall within the Priority Place, we really hope to end up with this braided approach that includes those Indigenous voices, but we are still in the learning process where we're building those relationships. We're getting that engagement. And it's currently at a different level than we are with some of our other partners. And so we're intentionally focusing on that to sort of bring them to more of an even, equal place together. And so during the course of the next couple of years, that's where we hope to be. And so right now we are funding some Indigenous partners to do some of that planning, some of that capacity building, whereas our partners like the Nature Conservancy, et cetera, might be hitting the ground to do restoration right now. And so we're trying to be very intentional, trying to be very open and take that more of that two-eyed seeing approach that we know is the right thing to do.
Wonderful. Thanks, Heather. And thank you for sharing those lessons learned as well. Very important to keep in mind. And we certainly hope to explore this topic further with our second set of guest speakers this afternoon as well. So please stay tuned. Our next question is from the audience. How can local researchers and citizen scientists contribute to the identification of priority areas, starting with Robin in terms of the identification of key biodiversity areas?
Yeah, so I guess I would say, first of all, we have had groups who have come forward and either just suggested sites to us or officially nominated them themselves. So I would suggest going to our website and reaching out about that, especially if you notice on our map that there's a site that you think could meet these criteria that isn't listed. Because we have had a lot of really great suggestions. As I mentioned, we're using data and expertise to build this project rather than doing fieldwork. So there's always a chance that there's data gaps that we don't know where the data is. So that's really useful. And one way to contribute directly to data is just to use community science tools like iNaturalist. And these can feed through both directly to our project and also just to provincial data sets, which eventually will reach our project as well. And you could even use something like the KBA map to see what species we're looking at in an area. And then if you do happen to see these, put them on iNaturalist or even email us directly if it's a really neat find. Thanks.
That's great, Robin. And just a quick follow-up then. So another audience member is wondering whether you can clarify whether the Great Lakes Shoreline Ecosystem Inventory, or GLSC, was used for the key biodiversity areas.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we're using so much data and these sort of data sets from both the provincial and the national government and other groups to guide our delineation. So that it's been really, really key to have access to all of these data sets for delineations. But for ecosystems specifically, if I'm understanding this question correctly, we actually have a new ecosystem coordinator specifically working to find these ecosystem sites in Southern Ontario. So this coordinator is using that data set alongside other provincial data sets to map out where these ecosystems and ecosites could be.
That's great. Thanks for the clarification, Robin. And Jocelyn, you already mentioned the lake-specific workshops that have been undertaken. Just wonder if you can speak more about who was engaged at these workshops and any future engagement opportunities.
Yeah, so we had, as I mentioned, we established an advisory group at the onset of the project. And it was, we wanted this methodology to be supported by our partners so that we were not just, doing this on our desktop and then sharing it without any input from our partners who may be using this information to inform their own priority setting. So the advisory group was established with participants not based on their agency per se, but more on their experience and expertise on the lake. So the advisory committee was comprised of people from, there were of course some like Environment Canada, the province, but also the Nature Conservancy and some other environmental organizations. So the advisory group then nominated or suggested participants for each lake that they thought we should be reaching out to. And again, not agency or discipline specific, but more based on expertise and experience. So subsequent cycles of, updating or opening up further analyses into these areas, of course, could involve additional people, depending on where you are on the lake or what your intended use of these areas is. And I think also through the lakewide management process, people can get involved in, contributing information to these areas. So I would just throw that out there that these are meant to be implemented through lakewide management. So for those of you who are involved in that process, that's another way to get involved with this assessment.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jocelyn. And to you, Heather, in terms of how local researchers and citizen scientists or those who would like to get involved, how might they be able to get involved?
I think from a Canadian Wildlife Service perspective, we do work a lot with citizen scientists. So I would sort of echo a few of the things that Robin mentioned. We do have a large effort underway right now called the Breeding Bird Atlas. And this relies on data from birders throughout Ontario. There are some pretty big gaps. I think people who are birders like to go to the spots where they're going to get their list species or whatever. There are a few areas where there is not as much data available. And so I think that's certainly one area in which citizens could participate in that process.
Wonderful. Thanks, Heather. And last question before we move on to our next set of guest presenters. What will success look like for you in terms of your priority places or areas, starting with Robin?
So for us, we're hopeful that over the next few years, we'll fill in that map and we'll be able to have a full data set of these KBAs across the country, both for species and ecosystems. So that at that point, we could pass along that data set for conservation planning purposes.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robin. Jocelyn.
Yeah, I will give 3 examples of success. One, ultimately, I guess, is that water quality and ecosystem health in the nearshore is improved, but also that data is shared and we are collaborating as Great Lakes partners and stewards of the lakes to set priorities more strategically and make sure that we are doing the right things in the right places.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jocelyn. Heather.
Yeah, I would say success for me is that combination, that sweet spot of doing both robust planning as well as implementation. Again, we have a window now through 2026. That is where our funding is. And so we need to do a lot of work based on what we know about our about needs for species at risk. And then at the end of the day, we need to have the right level of data so that we can actually track progress and demonstrate that this activity is having those positive impacts. And part and parcel of that is ensuring that we have strong partnerships because clearly we're not the ones out there doing the majority of the work. And so having that strong collaboration of partners across Southern Ontario is very important.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Robin, Jocelyn, Heather, for joining us and for the great discussion. All the best to you for your ongoing work and that we can continue to see the great work take place across the Great Lakes region. So next, we would like to invite our second set of guest presenters. So first, we'll hear from David and Cheryl. David and Cheryl, please go ahead and share your screen while I provide a brief introduction. David Bywater leads the Lands and Waters program for Georgian Bay Minidoka-Me Biosphere, and Cheryl Judge is a manager with the Georgian Bay Minidoka-Me Biosphere, who has been an educator for the past 16 years with a foundation in cultural knowledge and language sharing. And David and Cheryl, I see that your presentation is up, so the floor is yours.
Awesome, miigwech. All right, Ani Bojo, hello. As this is a large gathering, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the original people and lands and treaty territories that we benefit from. Those beautiful and magnificent places all along and over Turtle Island in this area, what is now known as Canada, Chimiigwech. Today, we'll be summarizing our collaborative species at risk project called Mamwe Anje Akizuin. Mamwe Anje Akizuin. As part of the larger community-nominated priority place funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada. The CNPP project came together as a collaborative project with 4 co-applicants working together on a vision and project for collaborative action on species at risk and biodiversity conservation in Canada. The logos on this slide represent the four co-applicants: Magnetawan First Nation, Shawanaga First Nation, Georgian Bay Land Trust, and Georgian Bay Minidoka-Me Biosphere. The other 2 logos are Wissahickon First Nation and Moose Deer Point. Together, these 6 partners form our steering committee and work collectively on this CNPP. Midwewe Kamagago Kwe Indishnikas, Name Endodem Anishinaabe Kwe Indao, Cheryl Judge Jaganashi Noswin, Shawanaga and Donjaba, Abading Medeo, Georgian Bay, Minidoka-Me Biosphere, and Doji no Ki. By introducing ourselves, we connect to each other in all of creation in many ways. In our introduction, we announce our name to all of creation. Midwewe Kamagago Kwe translates to sounding earth, sharing our English names to those that we are amongst as well. our clan so others may identify as clan relatives. Anishinaabe Kwe shares that I am an Ojibwe woman with she and her pronouns. Shawanaga Ndonjaba tells you that I am from Shawanaga First Nation. Abeding Medeo tells you that I'm in my first degree of learning with the Three Fires Healing Lodge. And Donji Anokian refers to the place that I work, which is Georgian Bay Menodogami Biosphere.
Annie Bojo, David Bywater, Indigenous, Katakenzi and Dodom, London and Donjaba, British Endow, Georgian Bay Minadogami Biosphere, Indoji Anoki. So I'm David Bywater. I don't have a clan. I'm from London, Ontario, British ancestry, and I also work for the Georgian Bay Biosphere. For those of you who may not be familiar with Eastern Georgian Bay and where the Georgian Bay Biosphere is situated, the red boundary there shows you our biosphere boundaries. So we're on the eastern edge of Georgian Bay. The Georgian Bay Minadogami Biosphere region is found in the province of Ontario along the coast of Georgian Bay and situated in Anishinaabeg territory, as recognized in the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1923.
You got David. We would like to acknowledge the original caretakers of the land, the Anishinaabeg. It is with such care that it is home to such high quality wetlands and biodiversity. When I think about this special place, I think about the conversation and instructions given by Gege Medado, the Great Spirit, to Nanabojo, the first original being. It was in this part of the creation story that the very first naming ceremony took place. If we envision Mama Aki Shkakamakwe, Mother Earth, in her very, very new and bountifulness, the beauty of all that she had, and how beautiful that would have been had to see her at that time. It was then that Gege Medado had instructed Nanabojo to go out and to give everything a name. And it was through those instructions to turn over every rock, look into every tree, and so that everything was asked to be given a name. Nanabojo went out 4 times and went into all of these different places and was able to give everything a name. Everything was given a name and everything was given a purpose. So there are a number of protected areas within the region, as well as First Nation communities and townships along the coast. This region is home to a diverse habitat and species, as well as 60 species at risk. With all of these in mind, this is a region that would benefit from strategic and collaborative approaches to conservation. Unlike other parts of Ontario that have landscape-scale conservation planning agencies, Eastern Georgian Bay is fragmented in this way and needs community partnership to create coordinated network across the landscape. Because we still have high-quality habitat and generally maintain populations of species, it's important to keep it that way and to work together to incorporate connectivity and species into planning and maintenance. As we rely on technology to provide us with great maps such as this, we also look to Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe language, as the original stories to tell us about the place names and the events that are described in the language. In 2021, the steering committee wanted to encompass the collective vision to a new name specific to the relationship of this beautiful place. After much sharing and understanding of teachings and consulting with a local language speaker, the words and meanings of together, land, renewal, and life were translated to Mamwe Anje Akizuan. Mamwe Anje Akizuan has many components which work together to holistically bring together these relationships to connect the land and the people. The logo intricately weaves together 4 sacred directions, colors, seasons, and medicines as a foundation for the care of water, land, air, and species. The Gizis, the sun, rises in Wabanung, the east, each day, bringing renewal to all of creation. We are currently in the time of Zigwen, the season of spring, when creation is waking up or returning to their homelands. Mamwe Anji Akizuan, a Nikian, and so this is going to show a little bit of the way that we work. The steering committee helps determine directions, protocols, and provide a multi-party governance approach. It is through this approach that we honor the 7 grandfather and medicine wheel teachings as our guide. We work as a team that continues to learn and navigate successes and challenges together. We prioritize gathering in community, which provides us with the ability to sit with each other and on the land, and keeps us connected. We continuously seek to extend the reach of these partnerships and work towards a 2-eyed seeing approach for the knowledge generation and co-managing priority ecosystems. We also aim to enhance best management practices across the region, inform planning strategies, enhance research ability through increasing infrastructure to do so. citizen science, and also focusing on road monitoring and reptiles and mitigation methods. This improved framework across all jurisdictions will enhance species at risk recovery efforts and provide important guidelines for shaping collective approaches to land use development. We are proud of the diverse partnerships that have been built so far, aiming to co-manage priority ecosystems in ways that result in biodiversity, habitat, connectivity, and greater resilience for species. We've learned that communication, understanding, patience, and trust are monumental for developing relationships. One of our goals and responsibilities within all of our work is to weave in Indigenous knowledge sharing at every opportunity available. Through this knowledge sharing, we have the ability to build capacity for staff, community members, partners, and greater community. In honoring reciprocity, we share knowledge and teachings in a variety of settings. Knowledge was given to us to be shared. We've held many Indigenous knowledge sharing circles with many staff, and we have a greater connection to all the species, especially for our road ecologists that meet road mortality reptiles on a daily basis. Incorporating stemma or tobacco offerings for those reptiles and the individual as a way to honor all of creation and to let go of grief at that time. With this foundation of respect and understanding, we care for all species we have the opportunity to work with. Through COVID, we've had to respectfully adapt in ways which we communicate, connect, and share Indigenous knowledge. Here we have two examples of two-eyed seeing with target species. This first was a partnership with Magnetawan First Nation species at risk biologist Alana on Michiquin, or the turtle. Another webinar was with Kilbear Provincial Park and Georgian Bay Anishinaabeg Youth Taylor Judge on the Jishigweg, the rattlesnake. We shared habitat and species knowledge accompanied with Indigenous knowledge and teachings. We often share storytelling, Anishinaabe, which is the Ojibwe language, and species gift and responsibility in our webinars and sessions. These videos are available for viewing on our YouTube channel. Two-eyed seeing. So along with what we've shared previously, this is actually a slide of some of our art commissions. These images were created to retell the recreation story, also known as the Great Flood. This art was created by Indigenous youth, Chista Kennedy from coastal community of Chimnasing First Nation. We still use these beautiful images as much as we can. These and many more webinars and videos can be seen on our YouTube and website.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. So with 4 co-applicants and lots of partners, the Collaborative Mamwe Anjayakizawin CMPP project has lots of important work going on, but unfortunately we don't have time to share all of it with you today. So we encourage you to check out our website that is linked there. On this slide, we have some thematic highlights from our work plan. And this is being done by the Biosphere, as well as Cheryl mentioned on our initial slide, by many of our partners on the landscape as well. For the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking about road ecology, which has been an important aspect and focus of our work plan since the CMPP project started. So why road ecology? Well, roads are one of the biggest threats to wildlife in our region. They pose a long-term threat to reptile populations and an immediate threat during construction. And many of our partners have identified the need for innovative strategies to be explored and experimented with. This slide presents a summary of our road ecology monitoring programs and key numbers. We are currently developing a model that uses our existing road survey data, as well as habitat and anthropogenic variables, to predict areas in Eastern Georgian Bay that have high quality habitat for reptiles and that are vulnerable to road mortality. This model can be used to better prioritize our mitigation efforts across the landscape. And we hope that this tool will allow us to shift our focus from reactive to more preventive measures. Our road ecology monitoring data is used to develop mitigation plans, which are then implemented and evaluated wherever possible with local partners. An example of an innovative approach has been to implement a turtle incubation program instead of installing silt fencing. For the same amount of money, if not less, you get more positive outcomes, such as protection of turtle nests, supporting the recovery of local turtle populations and wetlands, community involvement, and much more. So as previously mentioned, mitigation plans are developed for each road that we monitor, which includes identifying road ecology hotspots. This slide presents the road ecology hotspot map for Conservation Drive, which is located in the traditional lands of Wissahickon and Shawniga First Nations and in the township of Carling. For those of you who are familiar with this part of Ontario, you can just see there the word Kilbear on the slide. So Kilbear Provincial Park is a couple kilometers east. As this slide illustrates, the hotspot is located in the middle of a provincially significant wetland. For this road, traditional fencing options weren't possible, and that's because it's a really wet site, not surprisingly, because it's in a wetland, and therefore the traditional fencing would rust. Additionally, this wetland is home to the eastern fox snake, and as the picture on the right shows, it is an amazing climber, so it would easily climb traditional fencing. So the challenge was to design a fence that a fox snake can't climb. After reviewing options, we selected a concave style fencing that was based on a similar design tested by Haliburton Highlands Land Trust. However, the final design for this site is a first using materials of this size. Again, we needed to go scale up because fox snakes can climb. And many partners are watching closely to see if this fencing could be duplicated elsewhere to protect eastern fox snakes in other parts of its range in Canada and the United States. The local township led on the installation of the fencing and eco passages with support from GBB staff. Working with partners, this fencing is being studied over the next couple of years to answer some important research questions, such as, does the fence keep snakes and turtles off the road? Can they climb over it? What happens to the hotspot we saw? And how will this fence hold up to road maintenance, snow, severe weather? That's an important consideration for our municipal partners on this project. They were really happy to put in a fence that was at grade instead of above grade, because hopefully that'll be a lot better on maintenance activities. So by monitoring over the next couple of years, we hope to answer that question. An additional reason we selected this fencing is when we're doing the outreach and having conversations with Wissahickon and Shawniga First Nations, one of the things we heard about concerns with some of the traditional style fencing is that it impedes access to traditional hunting grounds. So by having something at grade, hopefully that will not impede that movement of species with the traditional fencing. We're grateful to the support, which has been critical to reaching and furthering our goals for species and habitat protection along the coast. Special thanks, of course, to our funders, being Environment and Climate Change Canada and Ganawin Mishkiki. Chimigwech.
Miigwech, David and Cheryl, thank you for the excellent presentation. Once again, we'll save questions until after Adam and Vari's presentations, so we hope that you'll be able to join us for a quick discussion after Vari's presentation. Now, I would like to invite our next guest speaker, Adam, to join us. Adam, please go ahead and share your screen while I provide a brief introduction. Adam is the Manager of Conservation and Trail with Bruce Trail Conservancy, where he has worked for the past 13 years. Previously, Adam has also worked in the City of Toronto's Forestry Department and Urban Forest Associates, preparing and enacting ecological restoration plans throughout Toronto.
So hi there, my name is Adam Berleski. I've been with the Bruce Trail Conservancy for 13 years, and I'm the Manager of Conservation and Trail. And today I'll be talking about the Bruce Trail and the Bruce Trail Conservancy, where we came from, sort of why we're here today in this particular discussion, and particularly how we're working to create a ribbon of wilderness, being a conservation corridor along Southern Ontario via the Niagara Escarpment. So our mission is preserving a ribbon of wilderness for everyone forever. And that ribbon of wilderness is the Bruce Trail, but more specifically, it's the conservation corridor that surrounds the Bruce Trail. And indeed, our vision is to secure a permanently protected natural corridor along the Niagara Escarpment. So I'm going to get into a little bit about the history of the Bruce Trail, what we do, and how we envision ourselves working and sort of existing within the conservation climate here in Southern Ontario. So I'm going to start back looking at 1961, when an article came out in the Financial Post asking, can they save this ribbon of wilderness? And that ribbon of wilderness was the Niagara Escarpment. Essentially what had happened that precipitated this article was a aggregate extraction organization, Dufferin Aggregates. They blew a hole right through the face of the Niagara Escarpment. We call this the Dufferin Gap, and it's still visible right now, sort of near Milton from the 401. If you're driving along the 401, there's a pedestrian bridge that crosses it now. But at the time, it was a huge call to action for a lot of people that realized the importance of the Niagara Escarpment and the fact that it was under threat of development. Particularly in Southern Ontario, where we've got so many people, the vast majority of Canada's population squeezed into a small area of land here. So development pressures were huge. So these people here were all members of the Hamilton Naturalists Association, and they took it upon themselves to realize that the best way to sort of give people an experience that would lead to an appreciation of the Niagara Escarpment would be to provide free public access to the escarpment. The gentleman on the far left is Ray Lowes, and he's the one that had this sort of idea. The fellow beside him is Robert Bateman, a famous Canadian painter who is still very supportive of the Bruce Trail. And not pictured here is a gentleman named Philip Gosling, who is the last living sort of pioneer of the Bruce Trail. And what he did was walk door to door along the Niagara Escarpment after they had mapped this particular path that they thought would be ideal for public access along the Niagara Escarpment, asking if landowners would be interested in allowing a footpath through their backyard or a portion of their property. And sort of bringing it back a little bit before 1961 when this happened, to about 400 million years ago. I should sort of mention that the Niagara Escarpment was created due to geological and climatic conditions at the time. Basically, 400 million years ago, there was a massive set of mountains that presently are the Appalachian Mountains. These mountains were larger than the Himalayas at the current Himalaya size right now. And all the mountains were depositing sediment via glacial rivers into a basin called the Michigan Basin, which is depicted on the left here by that yellow line sort of coming along Lake Ontario, going up the Bruce Peninsula, and then across Manitoulin Island down through Michigan, the northern peninsula of Michigan. So this inland sea was teeming with life for various hundreds of millions of years. Sometimes it was deposited, a lot of sediment was deposited from these streams, these mountain streams, and over the hundreds of millions of years, various sort of layers were created that all have a very calcium-rich rock to it, a dolostone rock, which is a form of limestone, which created the Niagara Escarpment that we see today, and it also created very unique ecological systems because of the high calcium content and the interesting different features that come with the Niagara Escarpment, including cliffs and crevices and karst topography. So what this resulted in was a 890-kilometer footpath from Queenston, Niagara to the tip of the Bruce Peninsula at Tobermory. And because these people were from the Federation of Ontario Naturalists, they were one of the clubs, they took a very similar approach to coordinating the management of the Bruce Trail, in that they sort of broke it up into 9 different clubs, all volunteer-based, sort of a grassroots approach to managing the trail, breaking it up into these 9 different sections. Each section has its own club, its own board of directors, and they make the decisions about trail placement and whatnot within their section, the purview of their section. And of course, now that things have developed, we've got a staff contingent of about 25 people who help to oversee the management of the trail, but also work towards its complete protection and securement through the acquisition of land, securing and protecting land for this conservation corridor that we're trying to create through Southern Ontario. So the Bruce Trail itself goes along 900 kilometers along the Niagara Escarpment, and it passes through a number of varied ecological habitats. So we've got remnant agriculture, active agriculture. We're very keen on ensuring that any active agriculture that exists on land that we protect continues to remain in production. And we also have a number of regulations and stipulations about haying times and pesticide use to ensure that species at risk are completely protected and are allowed to fledge, especially grass nesting birds and hayfields. The Bruce Trail crosses a number of different sort of coastal Great Lakes habitats as well, including the shorelines of Lake Ontario and Georgian Bay. It goes through mature forests, fields, deep ravines such as the Beaver Valley, swamps, wetlands, fens. So it's really a great cross section of the landscape of Southern Ontario. So collectively, with the main Bruce Trail and the side trails that we've also created along the Bruce Trail, we have about 1,300 kilometers worth of trails that provide free public access to anyone that's interested in exploring the Niagara Escarpment. We offer about 1,500 guided hikes per year, and that provides recreational, ecological, mental, and social benefits. Some of those hikes are geared towards nature interpretation and sort of fostering that ecological knowledge and a thirst for ecological knowledge for trail users. And of course, we also promote responsible hiking practices to make sure that the impact of this footpath is minimized as much as possible by our trail users. And for those of you that have never used the Bruce Trail, we actually took our blazing system directly from the Appalachian Trail. So we use a system of blazes. The blazes are white on our main trail and blue, or sort of a light blue, on our side trails. But as I sort of mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, the Bruce Trail is more than just a hiking trail. We're securing land and we're establishing natural protected areas so that we have a home for this footpath that's publicly accessible, but it's also a really important mission to protect a conservation corridor throughout Southern Ontario. So essentially we are a land trust, and I'll get into the amount of land that we own, but we're using nature-based solutions to address habitat loss, trying to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And we really impress on the urgency of the protection of the Niagara Escarpment and natural lands in Southern Ontario. And I can't really do this presentation without, again, sending out a massive thought of gratitude to all of our volunteers who help make this happen. We have about 1,500 volunteers that work with us to maintain the Bruce Trail and the conservation corridor. And without them, it would be absolutely impossible to do the work that we do. So in terms of the actual amount of land that we were involved in managing, we've been responsible for the protection of about 18,000 acres of land. Currently, we have almost 14,000 now acres of land that we actively manage. And that's represented by about 265 nature reserves that are managed by us. Approximately a third of that land is owned by the provincial government through the Ontario Heritage Trust, and we manage it for them exclusively. And on this managed land, our ecologists, of which we have 3, have observed 89 different species of different conservation concern. And this really drives our land stewardship work, identifying and ensuring that any species at risk or a sensitive species are protected and not affected by our hikers or anyone else on the Bruce Trail. This slide is really sort of to show the a visual representation of the conservation corridor that we've started putting together in a couple different areas. Firstly, on the very right of the page, there's a pink property. All of the properties in pink are BTC managed land. This is our very first acquisition that we acquired in 1976 near Old Baldy in the Beaver Valley. And currently it's still a bit of an island of conservation that we manage near Old Baldy. But what we're really working towards is these sort of conservation corridors as shown on the left of the screen, where we've got like large kilometers worth of land that we've protected that create this continuous natural corridor along the Niagara Escarpment. And we're still working to shore up these corridors. Right now we're at about 71% secured. And that includes land that's also publicly owned, which is represented in these pictures as the green shaded properties or parcels here. Again, it's very important for us to realize this conservation corridor, not just for the footpath, the Bruce Trail that we're creating, but also to protect escarpment ecosystems and the habitats therein. So the conservation work that we do is fairly varied. We do a lot of work through our volunteers. Each club has its own particular set of volunteers and different events that they offer. Tree plantings, of course, huge, very, very popular event for people to come out. But we also try to vary these types of ecological restoration opportunities to also include things like grassland restoration, meadow restoration. We're starting to get into some sort of aquatic restoration as well. Our volunteers are very interested in learning more about things like bird boxes and bee boxes, bat houses. So we do installation of those types of things on our property as well. And we also engage a number of corporate groups who come out and do invasive species removal for us. And we sort of turn it into a nice bonding experience for them. And it seems to be very popular. And in terms of our actual land stewardship and management, we have our 3 BTC staff ecologists that perform 3-season biophysical inventories on the land that we protect. And that amounts to about 1,000 acres per year, or on average 7 to 10 parcels of land that we bring into our portfolio every year. So when we're doing these management plans, they're really intended for to be used as a tool for our land stewards, our volunteer land stewards, who take them and use them as a guide for the future management of the property. So we'll try to, as much as we can, map all the different biophysical features on the property, ensure that we know where the species at risk are, map the ecological communities through ELC survey, ensure that we know where the invasive species are, and then also try to mitigate and identify any encroachment or trespassing that happens on these lands. And most recently, we're really proud to say that our new strategic plan going to 2025 now includes a particular pillar aimed at the conservation of the Niagara Escarpment. So there's a number of different initiatives that we've included in the strategic plan, the first of which being employ nature-based solutions along the Niagara Escarpment. And I'll use one of our most recently acquired properties as an example here. It's up on the Bruce Peninsula at Cape Chin. And this was the largest acquisition that we've had to date. It was about 550 acres of land. And it was former pasture land for the most part of it. And that gave us a lot of opportunities for restoration. So there's a 50-acre field that we will be, we just actually started the seeding in November, this past November, turning it into a native wildflower meadow. And we're also working to plant trees, shore up certain portions of forest to increase the tree canopy cover. So we've planted about 4,000 trees on the property so far, and we're going to be planting another couple thousand this coming season. And protecting species at risk. As I mentioned, we have about 89 different species of conservation concern that we've identified on our properties, and that really does, again, drive our land stewardship efforts. This particular slide shows a spread in our Bruce Trail magazine that came out a couple of years ago that depicted pictures of all the different species at risk or sensitive species that our ecologists have found along the Niagara Escarpment on our properties. And again, we're very proud that we're helping to mitigate concerns about protecting species at risk and all that comes there. And we're mitigating the impact of invasive species. So we also really recognize the fact that a trail corridor is a corridor for the spread of invasive species. We've just gotten into a partnership with Baffin to install 100 boot brush stations along the Bruce Trail, the entire length of the Bruce Trail, to not only allow people to brush off their shoes before they come into a natural area and when they're leaving, but also to provide sort of nature interpretation and educational opportunity through signage to educate people about the threat of invasive species and their impact to natural areas. We're also committed to embracing Indigenous knowledge. We're working with an organization called Plenty Canada to install 2 different healing gardens on properties, one in the south and one in the north. And these are really going to be an area where we're hoping to foster a better understanding of our colonial past and sort of reflections on moving forward with First Nations. Lastly, we're interested in collaborating with relevant sectors. So we have a number of different partnerships with different academic institutions and other organizations. We work with the McMaster Geology Department, and they've offered a number of different geo hikes, which are hikes that you can go online and sort of do a virtual hike of a particular section of the Bruce Trail, and they get really in depth into the geology and the significance of the geology with pictures and whatnot. We're working with the American Chestnut Council to potentially plant some American chestnut trees that have proven to be somewhat disease resistant along the conservation corridor. And we're also working with a number of other organizations to enhance research. We've got a partnership with the University of Toronto, where they're helping or using some of our land as test sites for biological control agents of garlic mustard. And this season we'll be looking at Phragmites as well, potential release of a moth that they're testing for a biological agent. And I should also mention that if there's anyone that's watching this today that sees some value in research on land that we own or manage, please reach out to us. We're always interested in making our land available for research purposes. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation, Adam. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Vari to join us for our final presentation. And again, we'll be saving questions for Adam after Vari's presentation. So Vari, please feel free to share your screen while I provide a brief introduction. Dr. Vari McFarlane is the Director of Science and Stewardship for the Ontario region of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. She oversees stewardship of NCC properties throughout Ontario and landscape scale planning for property acquisition. And welcome, Vari. I see you're ready to go, so the floor is yours.
Super, thanks so much. Yeah, it's great to be here, and thanks for all of you that have stuck it out to the bitter end today. I appreciate you sticking with me till the end. I'll try and whip through this fairly quickly so we have plenty of time for questions. I might skim through it a little bit fast, but I'm happy to clarify things afterwards. So yeah, I'm also going to talk a little bit about our conservation planning background, but whip through some examples of where we've been implementing some work on the ground in the Southern Great Lakes area in Ontario. So this is just a quick overview of the areas where the Nature Conservancy of Canada is particularly active in Ontario. if you've looked at a map of Ontario recently, you'll notice it's really, really big. In fact, it's about 910,000 square kilometers. Even if you get rid of all the lakey parts, then the terrestrial area is still really colossal. So our conservation planning approach is really aimed at, it's kind of a triage approach. It's aimed at trying to focus what are always limited resources in ways that we can hopefully get the best bang for our collective conservation back, if you like. So all of these green shaded areas are what we call natural areas. We have a landscape scale conservation plan that we've developed for each of these areas. And via implementing these plans over the decades that we've been active, we've actually contributed to conserving around 244,000 hectares in the province. And we've retained ownership of about 196,000 hectares. And those are the hectares that we do our best to actively steward across these areas. I will just quickly point out, those of you that may have seen this map in the past, a couple of new natural areas. This large area up in the north of Lake Superior, the Great Northern Clay Belt, and also the Central Ontario Corridors natural area over towards Eastern Ontario. These are new natural areas that we set up just a couple of years ago in order to take advantage of some really significant land acquisition, land protection opportunities that came our way. The Boreal Wildlands Project in particular is Canada's largest private land conservation project, is up near Hearst in the Clay Belt Plan. So these are really exciting new areas for us, and areas where we still have a lot to learn. So I probably don't need to even say this in this audience, but the benefits of conservation planning are really, really large. It allows us to focus our efforts. As I mentioned, we obviously can't do everything, even in partnership with the many other great organizations we've heard from today and over the last few weeks. We still need to focus because it's such a large landscape with so many interesting aspects of biodiversity in need of our help, and also so many threats. So our planning approach really is aimed at focusing resources as best we can. We do our best to make sure these plans are informed by the best available science. So many of the data collection and collation and curation efforts that we've heard about today are really key. Nature Conservancy of Canada is really grateful for all of those efforts and really take advantage of that when we're trying to work out where to implement conservation through securement and restoration. And our plans really do drive our work. We don't just write a bunch of plans and stick them on the shelf. We actually do implement them. We update them every 5 to 10 years, depending on the scale, and really use them to really improve the efficiency and effectiveness of our conservation work. We learn and do our best to improve whenever we can. There's 3 main scales too that we're really active in, at which we think about conservation planning. So the ecoregions are the kind of largest scale that we're currently looking at, and these are areas right across Canada which have relatively similar aspects of biodiversity, and in some cases share threats. We take usually subsets of those ecoregions and develop, as I mentioned already, what we call our natural area conservation plans. And implementing those plans in part is what drives our land securement, land protection work. And when we have secured property, then we develop a property management plan for each of those parcels of land. That's just a really quick overview of our conservation planning approach. So I'm going to go through quite a few examples of kind of each aspect of that, if you like, just to give you a snapshot of some of the things some of the fun, exciting projects that have kept us busy recently in Ontario. So I'll talk a little bit about some securement, some wetland restoration work, ongoing wetland management, and opportunities for engagement as well, that have all been driven by our conservation planning and our attempts to learn and get better at doing better work over time. So the first thing I'll jump into is our Brighton Wetland Securement Project. So this is on the north shore of Lake Ontario, just east of Presqu'île Provincial Park, if you're familiar with that area. It is an important bird area. It's a provincially significant wetland, and there's a ton of species at risk habitat in this area. And we actually were able to secure some properties way back in 2000 with a 30 hectare eco-gift. And then in 2014, we developed an updated Eastern Lake Ontario Coast Natural Area Conservation Plan, which really helped us focus in on priorities based in part on the securement that we had been able to do, but also based on the work of other partners on the ground and the presence of species and communities at risk. So building on that, we had other opportunities appear in the last, more recently in the last few years. And so we've actually amassed quite a few different parcels of land that are more almost contiguous or actually contiguous in this Brighton wetlands area. And again, we're very grateful to be able to work with partners, including Ducks Unlimited Canada, and to work with the EcoGifts program as well. And in this particular area, we've actually amassed around 154 hectares of significant land. And there's some really neat restoration opportunities on some of these parcels as well. We're looking at, again, working with Ducks Unlimited Canada to develop some both wetland areas, but also probably some shorebird scrapes as well to support migratory shorebirds. So that's a really cool opportunity to build kind of block by block through a securement approach, and now starting to look at restoration and ongoing stewardship opportunities. And that kind of segues, and we're now going to jump on a ferry and go across Lake Erie to Pelee Island, which is another area of our focus. We've been active working on Pelee Island actually since the 90s. And in the early to mid 2000s, when I started with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, these were the properties that I was stewarding out in the field. They don't let me go outside very much anymore, so I get to talk vicariously through my colleague Jill, who gets to do all the fun stuff now. So we own around 10% of Pelee Island. The kind of labels that you may not or may not be able to read are farmer agricultural lands that we have restored over time. Out on the island, we've done it by hand ourselves. We've collected seeds. We've fought through the massive thickets of really quite incredibly friendly poison ivy that Pelee Island is famous for, and collected seeds from native wildflowers, grasses, and acorns and nuts as well. And over time, we've restored, I think now actually all of the hectares that we own on the island currently. The one last chunk is up in the northeast corner here, and I think there's an animation, yeah. Up in the circle here, you'll see some little kind of pinkish bits. This was our last agricultural field that we had not yet restored. And looking at this historical map on the left on Pelee Island, you can see this really large area of marsh habitat, and that is actually Pelee Island actually used to be a collection of several little rocky islands, and through artificial drainage in part and ongoing drainage, then a whole bunch of agricultural land was essentially created, and so we've lost a huge amount of wetland and coastal wetland habitat on the island. And this is actually an opportunity for the Nature Conservancy of Canada to recreate a little tiny piece of that habitat that's been lost here. So this is what it looks like from up above. It was a soybean field for many years. It was a soybean field that would be heavily flooded most springs. And in fact, the very first time I got to go out to the island back in 2008, my colleague took me to see essentially a very large puddle, which is now been restored as a wetland. So we contracted Ducks Unlimited Canada to design a wetland restoration plan for us in here. That's kind of what you see in the map on the left. And it's been dug out to different depths. The idea is that we can accommodate lots of species of interest, species at risk, but also species not yet at risk, including migratory waterfowl and shorebirds, right in this one area. The kind of little white kind of snowball-like things on that map are actually little smaller separate little scrapes that we've constructed with a view to supporting salamanders, including smallmouth salamander, which is an endangered salamander on the island. So we're really excited that we're able to implement this. It has now actually been constructed. It is now finished. This is where you get to do conservation with a backhoe, which is lots and lots of fun. The incredibly heavy clay soils that Pelee Island is rather famous for are actually really helpful for building berms around wetlands. We didn't have to bring any other materials off-site. We're able to use the substrate that's there to kind of hold the water where we want it and make sure we're protecting our neighbours from any unwanted flooding that we would have control over. As is so often the case with wetland habitat, even in agricultural landscapes in southwestern Ontario, you kind of flood it and wetland plants pop out of the ground. It's incredible how persistent wetland seed banks can be. We have done some seeding of wetland species on various sites on Pelee Island, but a lot of what you see in the images here are actually just naturally self-seeded and from the seed bank. One thing that we're particularly excited to see popping up every time you dig a hole and it fills with water is Scarlet Amania, this not super exciting little plant up in the top right hand corner. Is a species at risk which seems to love any kind of wetland recreation attempts on Pelee Island. It responds incredibly well to that, which is really, really rewarding to see. We're now building on the habitat that we created and looking at what we can do to invite people to enjoy that and explore that and get to know it. And we've actually constructed our, I think in Ontario at least, our first bird viewing blind or hide, as I grew up calling them. I haven't actually seen this yet. I'm super excited to go out to the island in a couple of weeks and actually start doing some birding from here. The wetland that we've created is teeming with birds and will be again very shortly as things start migrating through. So it's really rewarding to have been able to create or recreate a little stopover area for a lot of birds that are increasingly struggling to find really high quality places to stop over as they work their way north and then again south in the fall. So that was wetland creation, and now I'm just going to touch very briefly on ongoing wetland management, which of course in Ontario you can't really talk about wetland management without mentioning our best friend Phragmites. So we've worked on an invasive Phragmites control program that started in the Long Point area. This is again a little further east from Pelee Island on the north shore of Lake Erie. Since about 2015, the Nature Conservancy of Canada has been part of the Long Point Phragmites Action Alliance. And we've been working collaboratively with many partners to address this very, very significant threat of non-native invasive Phragmites in these globally significant wetland habitats. The first phase of the project was aimed mostly at Phragmites management in Long Point proper itself and Turkey Point Marsh over here. And that involved, as I mentioned, multiple landowners, multiple partners, and lots of learning about how actually to manage Phragmites in these incredibly important and sensitive habitats that are, again, teeming with species at risk. We're able to build on the success of that project and are looking kind of inland and upstream a little bit, working upstream in the Big Creek watershed, working with many private landowners. I think over 400 private landowners now that we've been working with to manage to come in and manage cost-free to them for non-native invasive Phragmites on their lands. And that again has been a really successful project. It's been a really Phragmites is a fabulous invasive species because it's the one that everyone loves to hate for very good reason. Many different sectors have real challenges with it. It's obviously a huge challenge for biodiversity, but it's also a huge challenge for practical human stuff like sightlines along roads and fire risks to things like marinas full of expensive boats and all of these fun things. So it's a really, I hate to say it, was a really great species to kind of galvanize interest in the natural world in general, but also interest in actually doing something about reversing a really significant threat to both biodiversity and human values. So this has been a really great project that we're continuing to work with. It's continuing to snowball, and we're doing our best to keep up with it and keep building on those successes. So again, just skipping from that to another example of this, moving slightly north and west on the Soggy and Bruce Peninsula, sticking up into Lake Huron. We've also rolled out a similar private landowner stewardship project there, again, focusing on non-native invasive Phragmites, but also looking at a few other invasive species, including buckthorn and dog strangling vine, garlic mustard as well. And kind of rolling out what we learned from the Long Point area, and being really excited and privileged to be able to work with many landowners to really deal with some threats to biodiversity that we're already managing on our own properties, but looking a bit beyond that, we're able to really deal with things at a more strategic landscape scale, in a more strategic landscape scale manner. And that brings me to the kind of last example I wanted to really go into, is that we realized over the years that we need to do a much better job at proactive engagement with communities in the areas where we work, including in particular Indigenous communities and First Nations. And we've been incredibly privileged and grateful for the opportunity to do that, especially on the Soggy and Bruce Peninsula. Of course, the project, the area in which we work, is entirely within Soggy and Ojibwe territory, and that's something that we've always tried hard to acknowledge and to work out how we can actually be a helpful neighbor and a helpful community participant. So we've been really excited to be able to collaborate with First Nations, specifically Saugeen First Nation and Chippewas of Nawash unceded First Nation. We were really pleased to have Chiefs and Council support for the project, specifically the Phragmites control work. And as we continue to learn more about the impacts of Phragmites, not just on kind of the, if you like, traditional Western biodiversity values, but also on not necessarily species at risk, but species that are culturally significant and important for First Nations in particular. And we've been excited to be able to find ways to support Soggy and Ojibwe-led projects as well. So things like species at risk surveys, culturally significant species surveys, and so forth as well. These are just some examples of how opportunities have presented themselves based on kind of casting our eyes a little bit wider, looking at the landscape scale stewardship opportunities, if you like. And that is a very quick overview of some bits and pieces. Just wanted to leave you with some quick concluding remarks that I think conservation planning really can and in my opinion really should be the driver behind really every aspect of biodiversity conservation. So from the outset, planning what properties it is that you think are important to protect or secure one way or another, if that is something your organization happens to focus on. It can drive stewardship whether you own the land or not, and it can and should drive how you engage with people, local people, industry, First Nations, Indigenous communities, whomever is in the landscape. It's really good to have a bit of a plan and coherency with what it is that you think you can achieve and what it is that you can do in partnership, usually much better in partnership with all of the amazing people that are out there. So yeah, I will leave it there. I'm excited for questions. Sorry I whipped through that fairly quickly, but hopefully that leaves us plenty of time to chat. Thanks for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vari, for the excellent presentation. I will now invite Adam and David to please rejoin us for a quick discussion. So first off, same question that I posed to Robin, Jocelyn, and Heather earlier. Do you see an opportunity to apply the Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey results to help support your work, or any collaboration opportunities? Perhaps we'll start with David first.
Yes. One of the ways that we hope to use it is looking at getting an updated habitat mapping product for the larger Eastern Georgian Bay region. And so aspects of that survey, baseline survey, will hopefully be able to test some of the models that we'll be using, do some ground truthing in those ways. Hopefully we'll be able to use it shortly.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. And going in order, Adam?
Yeah, no, certainly. We're always interested in more information that can help us manage our land and sort of reach our conservation goals. So we would be, I think it would be great data to have. Also, we're more than happy, as I mentioned, to provide our land up for any other kind of research purposes. So happy to participate any way we can.
That's wonderful. And to researchers and citizen scientists who are listening, there is an open call currently from Adam. And Vari, next to you.
For sure. Data is always good. We like data and we like mapping. Those things absolutely underpin pretty much every aspect of our work. So I don't think I have much to add from what the other speakers already mentioned. I will add, and I should have mentioned this before, that again, also NCC properties are available for research. And if you're interested in coming out and doing fun stuff in our properties, then you can add that to the list of conserved lands that are available for work. Just give me a shout. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vari. And next question, we'll start with David first. David, it's clear that Indigenous knowledge is well integrated through your work. Do you have any advice or lessons learned that you can share for those who are interested in applying a two-eyed seeing approach to their work?
First off, I would say we're still learning. It's going to be a long journey for us. We've been trying recently with the CMPP funding to take a two-eyed seeing approach to our work, and that is going to take time. Lessons learned, definitely it's all about relationships. It starts off with building those relationships, getting the trust, working on reciprocity, responsibility, respect. Cheryl mentioned in her one slide, and taking a two-eyed seeing approach to some of that conservation planning. For our region, it's a really big, obvious region with a lot of partners and a lot of different values and threats and aspects to consider. So we're starting with a turtle plan and taking a two-eyed seeing approach, which is based on healthy country planning. So for those of you who use open standards, healthy country planning was based out of Australia, and it's a way of doing a more Indigenous-led two-eyed seeing approach to conservation planning.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. And Vari, I see that you wanted to jump in.
Sure. Yeah. As I mentioned, I think we're still on a learning journey as well. We're excited to keep learning as much as we can and work out how we can be a useful and effective partner, friend, supporter, whatever it looks like in each landscape. And we're working across such a diversity of landscapes, both within Ontario, but of course we're also a national organization, so right across the country. So we're doing our best to collate our internal learnings and work out how we can do a much better job of engaging with all communities and specifically including Indigenous communities. And many of us are Westerners and are aware that we have a lot to learn. I myself am a newcomer to Canada within the last 20 years, and acutely aware that there's a huge amount to learn about stewarding this incredible place. So on an exciting learning journey that we hope we can continue to do better.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vari. And just as a quick follow-up question, I wonder if you can elaborate more on how the NCC is working to support Indigenous-led conservation.
Yeah, good question. So I'm probably not the best person to be able to answer that, but we have recently started working more in Northern Ontario. So my colleague Kristen Ferguson and also Caitlin Richardson, they're looking more and more at looking at other effective conservation systems in the north, including Indigenous-led conservation opportunities. So again, we're really in a learning phase. We're trying to learn what, if anything, the Nature Conservancy of Canada can actually bring to the many existing tables out there. Quite often we're hearing that some of our GIS capabilities and our mapping and our conservation planning approach is something that many Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners would love to have a bit more access to, and that's something that we see we can provide as a way to support conservation decisions, or not even necessarily conservation decisions, but land management, land use, land access, depending on what the nature of the conversation is, depending on the landscape.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vari. And Adam, same question to you. Can you elaborate more on how the Bruce Trail Conservancy is supporting Indigenous-led conservation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, sort of echoing what the other speakers have said, we're at the beginning of our learning process, and we're sort of, our eyes are wide, our hearts are open, and we're working with the various First Nations whose territory falls along the trail that we've created to increase our understanding of how we can be a better ally and partner moving forward, and also provide sort of two-eyed seeing in the management of our land, specifically in the management plans that we're creating. So yeah, it's a learning process for everybody. We're really excited to be here moving forward. And yeah, it's something that we're going to be fostering, for the remainder of our existence here.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam. Next question is, so we heard from earlier speakers about different approaches for identifying priority habitats for conservation, protection, and restoration. Just wondering if you can share some of your process or criteria for identifying areas that you work in. Perhaps we'll start with Vari this time.
Sure. Yeah, good question. I'm not sure where to start. So especially in Southern Ontario, I think we've tried to take an approach of trying to get a bit of a balance between protecting the best of what's left, but also recognizing that there isn't very much left, so we need to make more. So our prioritization, our GIS-based prioritization work can kind of do that in two separate iterations. So we'll look at, for example, a significant wetland or forest or grassland and be like, hey, we should conserve that, or that needs to be conserved, protected one way or another. But we will also look at what we can do to make more of that. We have a decent track record of doing some pretty successful habitat recreation, restoration in Southern Ontario in particular. So we'll actually go through a mapping approach and work out, for example, if we want to conserve rare forest interior birds like Acadian flycatchers, Persona 3 warblers, we know from their recovery strategies that they like certain patch size of interior forest habitat. So our mapping exercise will look at where are those patches left in the landscape, and where are they not quite big enough, and where could there be a restoration opportunity in order to recreate what those animals need. And that's great when there's a bunch known about certain species. Other species it's not so easy, of course, but we do our best to take what is known and apply it to both securement and then subsequent restoration. And we will actually engage with securement or create securement opportunities in order to restore that land, in order to create those patch sizes that those specific species need. So in some ways, I guess a short way of saying it is that sometimes we'll actually prioritize trying to find the threat so that we can actually abate that threat at its source. When it comes to the things that NCC does, at least in terms of habitat protection and restoration. Does that make sense?
It's wonderful. Thanks, Vari. And going to David next in terms of whether you can share some thoughts on your process or criteria that you use for identifying areas to work in.
Sure. If you're thinking in terms of larger scale, it really depends on the partner, and that first step is meeting with the partner to better understand what their needs are, what conservation might mean to them. If we look at municipalities and environmentally sensitive zones is one way that they identify what the priority places are, and then looking at what information is used to identify those zones and maybe updating it, as I was mentioning, a mapping project. With First Nation communities, with CNPP, we've been able to do a lot of species at risk habitat surveys and mapping, and also doing bioblitzes as well to collect data on the landscape, get community involved. As one of the speakers mentioned, it's not just species at risk, but cultural information as much as possible as well. And then supporting our partners through that with funding so that this information can be rolled into land use planning. In other situations with our road ecology, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at where are the threats on the landscape, where are the species on the landscape, and then identifying what are the opportunities for mitigation. So those are different information we're using. We're developing that model that'll help to incorporate some of that data that we've been getting to come up with outputs that'll tell us where to best place some of these efforts for road ecology in the future. So lots of different ways and tools that we're using it, and it really depends on what part of the program we're talking about and the partner as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, David and Adam.
Yeah, so I think that we're a little bit unique here in our approach to land protection and conservation, in that we're trying to protect a linear feature, being, the Bruce Trail. So what guides us in terms of land protection is this conservation corridor that we're trying to create and the opportunity for the placement of a public footpath on it. So that's sort of the guiding principle for the land that we're looking to protect, I'd say.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam. And in our last few minutes, just want to see how government initiatives can better support your work. As we mentioned, this webinar series has been co-hosted by Environment and Climate Change Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and they're eager to know how they can better engage and support your work. So starting with David, how can government initiatives help to better support your work?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that one. Obviously, funding comes to mind. We've been grateful that we've got 4 years of CMPP funding and an additional 3, so that has been amazing. As I mentioned earlier, relationship building is such a key part of two-eyed seeing, and this is just starting, and it's going to take years, especially when you consider truth and reconciliation work and decolonizing conservation. So to understand that it's a long game here, and that support needs to sometimes look longer term as well. Mapping products are always great. Open source data, continuing to talk with partner organizations when projects are starting to define scope, geospatial area, what information might be included and gathered is obviously really important as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. Adam.
Yeah, well, it's a very appropriate question because we're actually just in year 2 of a massive grant that we received from Environment Climate Change Canada, which is a $5 million matching, one-to-one matching grant. I mean, so in terms of best help we can get, funding is #1 on the list, and we're very fortunate, we feel, to sort of receive this funding, this matching funding, and it's a really good call to action for our donors as well, sort of showing the support that the federal government has for conservation, especially in Southern Ontario.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam. And Vari.
Yeah, we're obviously incredibly grateful for the funding and support from both provincial and federal governments. And many projects obviously wouldn't be possible without that. So we're super grateful for what is. I think I would echo some of what we've heard, that especially when we're wanting to be like, we get the urgency of the biodiversity and climate crises, of course, and we want to do everything yesterday, and we should have done everything yesterday, but we didn't. But at the same time, it's also important to get it right. And so much of our work, all of our collective work here, requires careful and long-term relationship building with communities where we're working. So I think if there's ever any way to provide flexibility in funding timelines and decision-making processes around what you can and can't do within a given fiscal year, I realize that's, I'm looking for a Cadillac version here, but within the constraints of what's actually possible, then any kind of flexibility about timelines is going to become increasingly important if we, if and as we must value that kind of relationship building among all of the partners, community members at the table.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vari, David, and Adam, for the excellent discussion and for your excellent presentations today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. In closing, I'd just like to call on Greg to please provide some closing remarks.
Hi, just one quick question. Do you guys have a difficult time finding matching funding? More and more, we're seeing a real conservation ethos and spirit across Canada and in the Great Lakes Basin with new funding. Is it difficult for you to find matching? Because there's organizations like our own that are looking for you as boots on the ground and implementers of projects. But you know, there's only so many sources of funding. So quick answer. Anyone?
I would say yes. We're lucky in that we have a large number of and a great diversity of other funders, which we're incredibly grateful for as well. But it does introduce a very large administrative burden, I would say. And especially when there's situations where there is the potential for multiple funding sources, and keeping them all straight. And especially when there's a really short timeline to get the money spent out of the door again, then the matching component definitely adds a significant workload administratively to make sure that we're keeping everything straight. And we understand, we get it, but that's another thing, like to my previous comment about timelines being, you know, sometimes challenging when there's generous money available, but then there's constraints in your ability to actually make the best use of it at the right time.
Okay, I'm assuming this goes for everyone, but let me just say, where there's funding that is provided by the province and the federal government, wouldn't it be nice to have everyone involved in some of these projects, so you can have provincial and federal funding and minimize the constraints on matching? That's just my comment. But anyway, okay, I know we're at our time. I just want to thank everyone for staying with us, and we inundated people with information over the course of 4 webinars. So we appreciate that. We've had over 500 registrants. We thank everyone for attending. Over 25 external speakers. And I know that you guys are busy. You take the time out of your busy schedules, and we do appreciate you sharing your information. Everyone benefits from your experience. So a heartfelt thanks to all of you. Thanks to TRCA, of course, and Sharon for hosting the webinar series. A big thanks to our task team. Working throughout COVID in some pretty trying times over the last 4 years to complete habitat survey of the coastal margin of the Great Lakes that extends over 1 million hectares and 8,700 kilometers. So a big thanks. So our hope is that everyone has learned a lot through this webinar series. We know that we have some challenges in front of us. We've heard about significant challenges, at least not the emerging threats of climate change, which impact existing threats and stressors, which are going to be there because of our population and land use demands. But climate change certainly is a big consideration. The bright side is that we've seen over the course of 4 webinars that so many people have their hearts in the right places, and a tremendous amount of work is being done. And it's through cooperation and collaboration that this type of work is getting done. We take a part in that. The federal and provincial governments are part of the process. And it's through webinars like this that we share this type of information and rally troops. In the future, we can use lake-wide management and habitat and species, those annexes under the Water Quality Agreement and the Canada-Ontario Agreement, as rallying points for this type of forum and exchange of information, and put our minds together and strategically think of ways how to plan and establish criteria and identify priorities for habitat, and really with the intention of a shovel in the ground and implementation. And with new federal funding, I'm really positive that we're going to see some even more money to enable and facilitate conservation projects, and getting the process from identification to planning to engineering designs and implementation. Hopefully, we'll see more of that. Just a note on the survey and the data. Please do access the data, play with it. There's a great tutorial, a 101 tutorial that Sharon and our staff put together. It really walks you through how to access the data and how to manipulate the data. It's extremely well done. Let me see now. And then, of course, the questionnaire. It's your input that's going to make a difference in terms of our understanding of its utility, and its usefulness, and its application, and its data gaps, and where we can improve it. So please do fill out that questionnaire. And it's through that interactive survey, GIS 123, that you can actually identify your priorities and map them and put them on that interactive platform that we provided to you. So we then can identify and see where you think priorities are within the Great Lakes Basin. So with that, I will ask Neil. Neil, do you have any Any last minute comments from DFO?
Hey, thank you very much, Greg. I would keep it very short. I just want to say a big thank you to the effort to get this survey data together over the last few years. This webinar series, I agree, has been a fantastic way to get so much information out to many conservation practitioners. And I'm just looking forward and personally excited about the opportunity to work with so many that are here today. So, and kudos to you and the team, and certainly Sharon for the fantastic facilitation in the last 4 days.
Yeah, joint effort. Thank you to my staff, Anders Holders, Stephanie, Lydia, Rick, and thanks to DFO and MNRF once again. So that's it. That's all I want to say. So I'll let people go. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you so much for the closing remarks, Greg and Neil. And of course, the technical reports will be published soon on the Government of Canada's website, and Lake Superior Open Data will also be available soon on the Government of Canada's Open Data catalog. Thank you, everyone, and take care.